The Anchorage Incident. Stephen Michael Walker adjusted his security badge against the bitter January wind that cut across the tarmac of Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport like a blade forged in the Arctic itself. At 29 years old, Stephen had worked airport security for 7 years, moving up from baggage screening to his current position overseeing the perimeter patrol of North America's busiest cargo airport. The digital clock on his radio read 2:47 a.m. as he completed his third circuit of the night around the maintenance sector, his breath forming crystalline clouds that dissipated instantly in the -20-degree air. Stephen had grown up in Anchorage, born to Margaret Walker, a trauma nurse at Providence, Alaska Medical Center, and the late Daniel Walker, who had died in a fishing accident when Stephen was 16. His childhood had been spent exploring the Chugach Mountains with his father, learning to respect the wildlife that called Alaska home, while understanding the delicate balance between human civilization and the untamed wilderness that pressed against the city's borders like a living, breathing entity waiting for any sign of weakness. The airport sprawled across 4,000 acres of what had once been pristine wilderness, carved from the landscape in a testament to human engineering and ambition. Runway systems stretched in multiple directions, capable of handling the largest cargo aircraft in the world, while the passenger terminals processed over 5 million travelers annually. But it was the cargo operations that made Anchorage International unique. Positioned strategically between Asia and North America, it served as a crucial hub for global freight, with massive Boeing 747 freighters landing and departing around the clock, their engines creating a constant low-frequency rumble that had become the heartbeat of the facility. The maintenance hangar where Stephen now walked stood at the northern edge of the airport property, a cavernous structure that could house 3 wide-body aircraft simultaneously. Built in 1987 and expanded twice since then, the hangar served as the primary maintenance facility for cargo operations, staffed by a crew of 43 mechanics, technicians, and supervisors who worked in rotating shifts to keep the fleet airworthy. Tonight, the hangar was operating with a skeleton crew of 6 people under the supervision of lead mechanic Robert Bobby Chen, a 34-year-old Taiwan immigrant who had earned his aircraft maintenance certification from the University of Alaska Anchorage and had been working at the airport for 11 years. Bobby's crew included Jennifer Martinez, 26, an avionics specialist from Fairbanks whose father had been stationed at Eielson Air Force Base. Marcus Thompson, 41, a power plant mechanic from Detroit who had relocated to Alaska following a messy divorce. Yuki Tanaka, 28, a structural repair technician whose expertise with composite materials made her invaluable to the operation. Samuel Sam Kowalski, 52, a veteran mechanic whose 30 years in aviation had given him an almost supernatural ability to diagnose problems by sound alone. And David Kim, 24, a recent graduate from the aviation maintenance program, who was still learning the intricacies of keeping multi-million-dollar aircraft operational in one of the world's most challenging environments. The perimeter fence that separated the airport from the surrounding wilderness consisted of 12-foot-high chain link topped with razor wire, punctuated every 100 yards by motion sensors and surveillance cameras. The system had been installed in 2019 following a security audit that identified potential vulnerabilities in the airport's wildlife exclusion protocols. Alaska's unique position as a crossroads between urban development and pristine wilderness meant that encounters with wildlife were not uncommon, but the airport's location had been chosen specifically to minimize such interactions through careful environmental impact studies and consultation with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the airport's wildlife management specialist, had overseen the implementation of the current wildlife control measures. At 37, Dr. Vasquez held a PhD in wildlife biology from the University of Alaska Fairbanks and had spent 15 years studying human-wildlife interactions across Alaska. Her protocols emphasized prevention over confrontation, utilizing a combination of habitat modification, deterrent systems, and early warning networks to minimize the likelihood of dangerous encounters. The system had been remarkably successful, with only 3 significant wildlife incidents in the past 5 years, none involving large predators. The weather conditions on the morning of January 8, 2025, were typical for an Anchorage winter. The temperature had dropped to minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, with winds gusting from the northeast at 15 to 20 miles per hour, creating a wind chill that made exposed skin vulnerable to frostbite within minutes. Visibility was good, despite the early morning hour, with a 3/4 moon providing enough illumination to see clearly across the snow-covered landscape. The aurora borealis painted green and gold streamers across the northern sky, a reminder of Alaska's position at the edge of the civilized world. Airport Operations Manager Patricia "Pat" Sullivan had been monitoring weather conditions from the control tower since beginning her shift at midnight. At 45, Pat had worked in airport operations for 23 years, starting as a ground controller at Fairbanks International before transferring to Anchorage in 2008. Her experience had taught her to read the subtle signs that indicated potential problems, and she maintained constant communication with all departments to ensure seamless operations regardless of conditions. Tonight's forecast called for temperatures to drop another 10 degrees before dawn, with the possibility of light snow developing after sunrise. The first indication that something was amiss came at 2:51 a.m. when motion sensors along the northeastern section of the perimeter fence detected movement. Stephen Walker was approximately 200 yards from the sensor location, conducting his routine inspection of the maintenance area lighting system. The alert came through his radio as a series of electronic tones, followed by the calm voice of security dispatcher Maria Santos, a 23-year-old recent graduate of the University of Alaska Anchorage's criminal justice program, who had been working the night shift for 8 months. Unit 7, we have motion detection at Sensor Station Alpha 12, northeastern perimeter. Please investigate and report. Maria transmitted from the security control room, located in the main terminal building. The control room housed an array of monitoring equipment that would have impressed a small television station, with dozens of screens displaying feeds from cameras positioned throughout the airport property. Maria's training had emphasized the importance of treating every alert seriously while maintaining composure, as false alarms were common due to the extreme weather conditions and occasional wildlife presence. Stephen acknowledged the transmission and altered his route toward the sensor location, his boots crunching through the fresh snow that had accumulated since the overnight maintenance crews had last cleared the area. The northeastern perimeter bordered the Chugach National Forest, a 6 million-acre wilderness area that began literally at the airport's fence line. Despite the proximity to civilization, this section of forest was home to a complete ecosystem of Alaska wildlife, including moose, wolves, lynx, black bears, and the apex predator of the North American continent, the Alaska brown bear, more commonly known as the grizzly bear. The adult male grizzly bear that had triggered the motion sensors was a specimen that would have impressed even the most experienced wildlife biologists. Standing 4 feet at the shoulder and weighing approximately 850 pounds, the bear represented the genetic pinnacle of ursine evolution. His coat was a rich chocolate brown with silver-tipped guard hairs that caught the moonlight as he moved through the forest with surprising stealth for such a massive creature. At an estimated age of 15 years, he had survived countless challenges in one of the world's most unforgiving environments, developing the intelligence, strength and cunning that had made him the undisputed master of his territory. This particular bear's territory encompassed nearly 40 square miles of the Chugach foothills, including the area directly adjacent to the airport. He had been tracked intermittently by Dr. Vasquez's wildlife monitoring program since 2019, when he had first appeared on trail cameras as a large adult male. Wildlife officials had designated him Bear Number 47 in their database, though they had never had occasion to collar or closely study him due to his elusive nature and apparent avoidance of human contact. His presence near the airport had been noted several times over the years, but always at a respectful distance, leading researchers to conclude that he understood the boundaries between his domain and human territory. What Dr. Vasquez and her team could not have known was that Bear Number 47 had not entered his normal winter denning behavior this year. Climate change had affected traditional denning patterns throughout Alaska, with warmer temperatures and irregular snowfall patterns disrupting the biological triggers that prompted bears to begin their winter sleep. Additionally, a late-season salmon run in nearby streams had provided abundant food sources well into December, allowing the bear to continue actively foraging when he should have been settling into dormancy. The bear's decision to approach the airport perimeter on this particular night was influenced by several factors that created a perfect storm of circumstances. A recent warm spell had melted and refrozen snow layers, creating a crust that made foraging in his usual territory difficult. The constant noise and activity at the airport, which normally served as an effective deterrent, had become familiar background sound that no longer triggered avoidance behaviors. Most critically, the bear's enhanced metabolism from continued foraging had created nutritional demands that overrode his natural caution regarding human presence. Stephen Walker approached Sensor Station Alpha 12 with the casual confidence of someone who had responded to hundreds of similar alerts over the years. In his experience, motion detectors were triggered by everything from wind-blown debris to wandering moose to the occasional raven investigating garbage containers. The sophisticated sensor array could distinguish between different types of movement signatures, but the extreme cold affected electronics in unpredictable ways, leading to frequent false positives that were simply part of working in Alaska. The sensor station consisted of a 20-foot pole supporting infrared motion detection equipment, a high-definition camera with night vision capability, and an emergency communication beacon that could be activated manually in case of equipment failure or security incidents. The equipment was housed in weatherproof enclosures designed to function reliably at temperatures as low as -40 degrees Fahrenheit, though even the most robust electronics occasionally succumb to Alaska's brutal climate. As Stephen approached the sensor location, he followed standard protocol by announcing his position to the security control room and requesting camera confirmation of the area. Maria Santos acknowledged his transmission and activated the camera associated with Alpha 12, her fingers dancing across the control console with practiced efficiency. The high-definition display filled with an image of the perimeter fence area, showing Stephen's approaching figure as a bright white heat signature against the darker background of snow and vegetation. Unit 7, camera shows all clear at your location. Probably another sensor malfunction from the cold, Maria reported, her voice carrying the slight resignation that came from dealing with equipment challenges on a nightly basis. The camera's infrared capability provided excellent visibility in the darkness, but the extreme cold could affect image quality and create thermal shadows that obscured details. Stephen was 50 yards from the fence line when he first noticed the tracks. What had appeared from a distance to be routine snow disturbance resolved into a clear trail of massive paw prints leading directly toward the airport perimeter. Each track measured nearly a foot in length and 8 inches in width, with distinct claw marks extending several inches beyond the pad impressions. The tracks were fresh, probably made within the past hour based on their sharp definition and the absence of wind-blown snow accumulation. Having grown up in Alaska, Stephen immediately recognized the tracks as belonging to a large brown bear, though the size exceeded anything he had encountered during his years of hiking and camping with his father. His training in security procedures had included wildlife awareness modules, but the protocols focused primarily on detection and reporting rather than direct confrontation. The standard procedure called for immediate notification of airport operations and wildlife management specialists, followed by area evacuation and implementation of deterrent measures. Stephen keyed his radio and reported his findings, his voice maintaining professional composure despite the adrenaline that was beginning to course through his system. Control, Unit 7. I have large bear tracks approaching the perimeter fence at Alpha 12. Tracks appear fresh, probably made within the last hour. Requesting wildlife management and operations notification. Maria Santos acknowledged the report and immediately began implementing the wildlife encounter protocol that Dr. Vasquez had developed for exactly this type of situation. Her first call was to Pat Sullivan in airport operations, followed by an attempt to contact Dr. Vasquez at her home phone number. The protocol called for cautious monitoring while preparing for potential escalation, including the possible temporary closure of the affected runway if the bear's approach brought it into the operational area of the airport. Pat Sullivan received the notification while monitoring inbound cargo traffic from her position in the control tower. As operations manager, she had dealt with wildlife encounters before, though most had involved moose or smaller animals that posed minimal threat to airport operations. A large bear presented a more serious challenge, particularly given the proximity to the maintenance hangar where personnel were working overnight shifts. Her first priority was ensuring the safety of airport personnel, followed by maintaining operational continuity for the cargo flights that represented millions of dollars in revenue. Dr. Vasquez was awakened by her phone at 3:07 a.m., emerging from deep sleep with the instant alertness that came from years of responding to wildlife emergencies. Her first questions focused on the exact location and apparent behavior of the bear, information that would be crucial in determining the appropriate response. Bears approaching human facilities could be motivated by various factors, from simple curiosity to active foraging to defensive behavior if they felt cornered or threatened. While the notification process unfolded, Stephen continued his approach to the perimeter fence, following the bear tracks with growing concern. The tracks indicated that the bear had not simply wandered near the fence and departed, but had deliberately approached the barrier and appeared to have spent time investigating its structure. Several areas showed signs where the animal had reared up on its hind legs, probably to look over or test the height of the fence, with claw marks visible on the chain link at heights that suggested a bear of exceptional size. The fence design that had seemed adequate when installed suddenly appeared far less formidable when confronted with evidence of an 800-pound predator that had clearly given serious consideration to breaching it. The chain link construction that could easily contain human intruders or smaller wildlife was never intended to serve as a barrier against a determined grizzly bear, particularly one of unusual size and apparent boldness. Stephen's examination of the fence line revealed the first indication of compromise at 3:12 a.m. A section of chain link approximately 20 feet from sensor station Alpha 12 showed signs of damage that were initially difficult to interpret in the darkness and cold. Using his high-powered flashlight, Stephen could see that several of the horizontal support wires had been broken and that the fence fabric had been pulled away from one of the vertical posts. The damage pattern was consistent with significant force applied from the outside, though it was unclear whether the bear had actually breached the perimeter or had simply tested the barrier's integrity. Control Unit 7. I have fence damage at Alpha 12. It looks like the bear may have tried to get through the perimeter. I need maintenance and wildlife response immediately, Stephen reported, his voice now carrying an edge of urgency that reflected his growing realization that the situation was escalating beyond routine wildlife monitoring. Maria Santos felt her pulse quicken as she processed Stephen's report. Fence damage suggested that the bear was not simply passing through the area, but was actively attempting to access the airport property. Her training had covered various wildlife scenarios, but the prospect of a large predator actually breaching the perimeter was the kind of worst-case situation that had been discussed in theoretical terms during training sessions. The maintenance hangar was located approximately 400 yards from the damaged fence section, well within the range of a bear that had demonstrated the ability and willingness to overcome man-made barriers. Bobby Chen and his crew were focused on their work inside the hangar, unaware of the developing situation outside. The hangar's massive doors were partially open to facilitate equipment movement, creating a direct path between the interior workspace and the outside environment. Dr. Vasquez arrived at the airport at 3:28 a.m., driving directly to the security checkpoint, where she was met by Pat Sullivan and briefed on the developing situation. As the airport's wildlife management specialist, Dr. Vasquez carried specialized equipment for dealing with large animal encounters, including high-powered tranquilizer equipment, noise-making devices designed to frighten wildlife, and communication gear that allowed direct contact with Alaska Department of Fish and Game personnel who could provide additional support if needed. The drive to the maintenance area took Dr. Vasquez and Pat Sullivan past the normal bustling activity of the cargo operations, where ground crews continued loading and unloading aircraft, oblivious to the drama unfolding at the perimeter. The juxtaposition between routine human activity and potential wildlife crisis highlighted the delicate balance that defined life in Alaska, where civilization and wilderness existed in constant tension. Stephen Walker had maintained his position near the damaged fence section, following protocol by monitoring the area while avoiding actions that might escalate the situation. His years of experience in the Alaska outdoors had taught him to respect wildlife while maintaining appropriate caution, but the current situation exceeded anything from his previous experience. The tracks he was following indicated a bear of exceptional size that had demonstrated both the physical capability and the behavioral inclination to challenge human-built barriers. At 3:34 a.m., Stephen reported movement in the tree line beyond the damaged fence section. Control, I have visual contact with a large brown bear approximately 100 yards past the perimeter fence. The animal appears to be moving parallel to the fence line in the direction of the maintenance hangar. This is a very large bear, probably 800 pounds or more. The sighting confirmation transformed the situation from potential threat to active wildlife encounter, triggering the next level of response protocols. Dr. Vasquez immediately activated her emergency communication system to alert Alaska Department of Fish and Game personnel, and began deploying specialized equipment designed for managing large predator encounters. Her experience had taught her that bears of this size and apparent boldness represented significant danger, particularly in the confined environment of an airport where escape routes were limited. Bear number 47 had spent nearly an hour investigating the airport perimeter, his keen intelligence processing the sights, sounds, and smells that defined the boundary between his natural territory and human civilization. The constant noise from aircraft operations had initially heightened his caution, but the regular patterns of sound had become familiar, reducing their effectiveness as deterrents. More significantly, the bear had detected food odors emanating from the maintenance area, where the night shift crew had brought meals and snacks to sustain them through their work period. The bear's enhanced metabolism from his extended foraging period had created nutritional demands that overrode many of his natural behavioral inhibitions. While a normally behaved bear would typically avoid human presence, bear number 47's current physiological state was driving increasingly bold behavior as he sought to satisfy his caloric requirements. The airport environment, with its concentration of human activity and associated food sources, had begun to register as a potential foraging opportunity rather than a threat to be avoided. Dr. Vasquez's assessment of the situation led her to conclude that the bear was exhibiting food-seeking behavior rather than territorial aggression, a distinction that was crucial for determining appropriate response strategies. Food-motivated bears could often be deterred through noise-making and harassment techniques that encouraged them to seek easier foraging opportunities elsewhere. However, the bear's apparent willingness to damage the perimeter fence suggested a level of determination that might require more aggressive intervention. The decision to attempt hazing techniques was made at 3:41 a.m., with Dr. Vasquez positioning herself at a safe distance from the fence line, while preparing noise-making devices designed to create sounds that would frighten the bear away from the airport property. Stephen Walker was instructed to maintain his observation position, while additional security personnel were summoned to establish a perimeter that would keep airport workers away from the affected area. The first hazing attempt involved the activation of propane-powered noisemakers that produced sharp, explosive sounds designed to startle wildlife. The devices had proven effective in previous encounters with smaller bears and other wildlife, but bear number 47's reaction was markedly different from expected patterns. Rather than retreating from the noise, the bear appeared to investigate the source of the sounds, moving closer to the fence line with what could only be described as curious rather than fearful behavior. The bear is not responding to noise deterrents as expected, Dr. Vasquez reported to Pat Sullivan via radio. This animal is showing unusual boldness that may indicate a food-conditioned or otherwise habituated individual. We may need to consider more aggressive intervention options. The failure of initial deterrent attempts marked a critical escalation point in the developing crisis. Bears that did not respond appropriately to hazing techniques were classified as problem animals that posed increased danger to human safety. Dr. Vasquez's protocols called for immediate consultation with Alaska Department of Fish and Game personnel to determine whether lethal intervention might be necessary to protect human life and property. At 3:47 a.m., bear number 47 made the decision that would transform a manageable wildlife encounter into a catastrophic emergency. The bear approached the damaged section of perimeter fence and began systematically enlarging the opening that his earlier investigation had created. Using a combination of brute strength and surprising dexterity, the bear pulled chain-link fabric away from support posts and bent horizontal support wires until he had created an opening large enough to accommodate his massive frame. Stephen Walker watched in fascination and growing horror as the bear methodically breached the airport perimeter. Control, the bear is coming through the fence. Repeat, the bear has breached the perimeter and is on airport property. I need immediate backup and evacuation of the maintenance hangar. The breach notification triggered the airport's wildlife emergency protocol, a comprehensive response plan that had been developed through coordination between airport operations, wildlife management, and emergency services. Pat Sullivan immediately activated the emergency communication system that would alert all airport personnel to the developing crisis while initiating contact with Anchorage Police Department, Alaska State Troopers, and emergency medical services. Maria Santos began the process of notifying the maintenance hangar crew of the approaching danger, her voice maintaining professional calm despite the unprecedented nature of the situation. Maintenance Hangar 1, this is security control. We have a wildlife emergency in your area. A large bear has breached the perimeter fence and is approaching your location. Please secure your area and prepare for possible evacuation. Bobby Chen received the notification while inspecting the main landing gear assembly of a Boeing 747-400F that had been experiencing hydraulic pressure anomalies. The concept of a bear approaching the hangar struck him as surreal given the industrial environment and constant human activity. But his experience working in Alaska had taught him to take wildlife warnings seriously, regardless of how unlikely they might seem. Copy that, Control. We're securing the hangar and moving personnel to safe areas, Bobby responded, immediately beginning the process of gathering his crew and moving them away from the hangar's open doors. The hangar's design provided numerous hiding places and elevated positions that could offer protection from ground-based threats, though none of the crew had ever anticipated needing such protection from wildlife. Jennifer Martinez was working on avionics equipment in the aircraft's nose section when Bobby's shouted warnings reached her. The urgency in his voice cut through the constant background noise of the hangar environment, immediately capturing her attention and triggering the heightened alertness that came from years of working in potentially dangerous industrial settings. Her military background had provided training in emergency response, though the prospect of encountering a large predator in an airport maintenance facility was unlike anything from her previous experience. Marcus Thompson was underneath the aircraft performing routine inspection procedures when the evacuation order came. His position beneath several tons of aircraft required careful movement to avoid injury, but the urgency of Bobby's commands prompted him to abandon normal safety protocols in favor of rapid withdrawal. His experience with dangerous situations during his years in Detroit had developed instincts that served him well in recognizing when immediate action was more important than following standard procedures. Yuki Tanaka was in the hangar's parts storage area when the alert was issued, surrounded by shelving units containing thousands of aircraft components worth millions of dollars. Her first instinct was to secure sensitive equipment, but Bobby's increasingly urgent commands made clear that personal safety took precedence over property protection. She began moving toward the hangar's emergency exits while mentally cataloging the quickest routes to elevated positions that might provide protection from ground-based threats. Sam Kowalski had worked in Alaska long enough to understand that wildlife warnings were never issued lightly, particularly in the industrial environment of an airport where natural predators would normally never venture. His 3 decades of aviation experience had included numerous emergency situations, but the prospect of a large bear entering the maintenance hangar represented a completely unprecedented challenge that fell outside all normal operational procedures. David Kim was the youngest member of the crew and had the least experience with Alaska wildlife, having relocated to Anchorage only 6 months earlier. His initial reaction to the bear warning was disbelief mixed with concern that he might be the target of some sort of practical joke that Alaska veterans played on newcomers. However, the obvious seriousness in Bobby's voice and the rapid response of the other crew members quickly convinced him that the threat was genuine. Bear number 47 emerged onto airport property at 3:52 a.m., his massive form moving across the snow-covered ground with surprising stealth. The industrial environment of the airport was unlike anything in his previous experience, but his keen intelligence quickly adapted to the new surroundings as he processed the overwhelming array of sights, sounds, and smells that defined human civilization. The constant background noise of aircraft operations provided acoustic camouflage that allowed him to move without attracting immediate attention from airport personnel who were not involved in the developing emergency response. The bear's approach to the maintenance hangar was not random, but was guided by his acute sense of smell, which had detected food odors emanating from the facility. The maintenance crew's dinner breaks and snack consumption had created an olfactory trail that registered clearly in the bear's consciousness as potential foraging opportunity. His hunger-driven state made these food odors irresistible attractants that overrode his natural caution regarding human presence. Stephen Walker maintained his observation position at the perimeter fence, providing running commentary on the bear's movements to the security control room. His unique vantage point allowed him to track the bear's progress across the airport property while remaining at what he hoped was a safe distance from the unfolding crisis. His experience in Alaska wilderness had provided familiarity with bear behavior, but the current situation exceeded anything from his previous encounters with wildlife. Control, the bear is approximately 200 yards from the maintenance hangar and closing. The animal appears to be moving purposefully toward the building rather than wandering randomly. Maintenance crew should be fully evacuated immediately, Stephen reported, his voice carrying the tension of someone who was witnessing the approach of a potentially catastrophic encounter. Dr. Vasquez had repositioned herself to maintain visual contact with the bear while remaining at a safe distance, her specialized equipment ready for deployment if opportunities for intervention presented themselves. Her assessment of the bear's behavior pattern indicated a highly motivated animal that was unlikely to be deterred by standard hazing techniques. The bear's size, apparent boldness, and purposeful movement suggested that more aggressive intervention methods might be necessary to prevent a catastrophic encounter. The notification of Alaska Department of Fish and Game personnel had resulted in the dispatch of wildlife enforcement officers equipped with specialized equipment for dealing with problem bears. However, their estimated arrival time was still 45 minutes away, leaving airport personnel to manage the crisis with local resources for the immediate future. The time delay highlighted one of the challenges of wildlife management in Alaska, where vast distances and limited personnel meant that emergency response was often dependent on local capabilities. Pat Sullivan coordinated the emergency response from the Airport Operations Center, maintaining communication with multiple agencies while tracking the bear's approach to the maintenance facility. Her experience in airport operations had included numerous emergency situations, from aircraft mechanical failures to severe weather events, but the current crisis represented a completely unique challenge that fell outside all normal operational procedures. The potential for injury or death to airport personnel created liability concerns that extended far beyond routine operational issues. Bear number 47 reached the perimeter of the maintenance area at 3:57 a.m., pausing to investigate the array of ground support equipment that surrounded the hangar. His curiosity about the unfamiliar machinery led him to investigate several vehicles, including a diesel-powered tug used for moving aircraft and a fuel truck that had been parked near the hangar entrance. The bear's investigation of the vehicles involved significant physical contact, including climbing onto equipment and using his claws to investigate surfaces and openings that attracted his attention. The sound of the bear's interaction with ground support equipment carried clearly across the maintenance area, alerting Bobby Chen and his crew to the immediate proximity of the threat. The metallic sounds of claws on metal surfaces and the occasional grunt or huffing sound that accompanied the bear's investigation created an audio signature that was unlike anything the maintenance personnel had previously encountered in their work environment. "Control, we can hear the bear outside the hangar. It sounds like it's investigating the ground equipment. We're positioned in the elevated areas of the hangar and have secured all access points. But this building was never designed to keep out wildlife," Bobby reported, his voice reflecting the stress of managing personnel safety in an unprecedented situation. The maintenance hangar's design provided numerous elevated positions that offered relative safety from ground-based threats, including catwalks, equipment platforms, and aircraft access points that were well above ground level. However, The facility's primary entrances were designed for aircraft and vehicle access rather than security, creating multiple potential entry points that could not be effectively secured with the resources available to the maintenance crew. Jennifer Martinez had positioned herself on a platform near the hangar's main electrical distribution panel, a location that provided good visibility of the hangar floor while offering multiple escape routes if the situation deteriorated. Her military training had emphasized the importance of maintaining situational awareness and identifying fallback positions, principles that proved valuable in the current crisis, even though the specific threat was unlike anything from her previous experience. Marcus Thompson had climbed to the top of a mobile work platform that provided access to aircraft engines during maintenance procedures. The platform's height offered excellent visibility and relative security, though he was acutely aware that his position would become a trap if the bear managed to compromise the platform's stability. His experience with urban dangers had taught him to always consider multiple escape routes, a practice that served him well in adapting to the current wilderness threat in an industrial setting. Yuki Tanaka had found refuge in the hangar's parts storage loft, an elevated area that required climbing a vertical ladder to access. The position offered excellent protection from ground-based threats while providing storage areas where she could remain hidden if necessary. Her technical background had provided familiarity with industrial safety principles, including the importance of securing elevated positions during emergency situations. Sam Kowalski had positioned himself near the hangar's emergency communication equipment, maintaining contact with airport operations while monitoring the situation from a platform adjacent to the main aircraft maintenance bay. His 30 years of experience had taught him the value of maintaining communication during emergency situations, a principle that proved crucial for coordinating response efforts and keeping airport operations informed of developing conditions. David Kim had followed the other crew members to elevated positions, but remained the most anxious about the developing situation. His limited experience with Alaska wildlife left him uncertain about bear behavior patterns and appropriate response strategies. He had positioned himself on a catwalk that provided access to the hangar's lighting systems, a location that offered relative safety while keeping him close to more experienced crew members who could provide guidance. Bear number 47 completed his investigation of the ground support equipment and turned his attention to the maintenance hangar itself at 4:03 a.m. The building's partially open doors provided clear access to the interior, where the bear's acute senses detected the concentrated food odors that had originally attracted him to the facility. The industrial environment was unlike anything in his previous experience, but his intelligence and adaptability allowed him to quickly assess the structure and identify potential entry points. The bear's approach to the hangar entrance was cautious but determined, his massive frame moving with the fluid grace that characterized apex predators. Despite his size, Bear number 47 was capable of remarkable stealth when circumstances required, a capability that had served him well during his years of survival in the Alaska wilderness. The industrial sounds and constant background noise of the airport provided acoustic camouflage that allowed him to approach the building without alerting the human occupants to his immediate proximity. Stephen Walker maintained his observation position, providing real-time updates on the bear's movements to security control and the various emergency response agencies that were coordinating their response to the crisis. His unique vantage point allowed him to see the bear's approach to the hangar while remaining far enough away to avoid immediate danger, though he was acutely aware that his position could become untenable if the bear decided to investigate other areas of the airport property. Control. The bear is at the hangar entrance. The animal appears to be investigating the building and may be preparing to enter. Maintenance crew should be prepared for immediate close contact, Stephen reported, his voice carrying the tension of someone who was watching a potentially catastrophic situation unfold in real time. Dr. Vasquez had moved to a position where she could observe the hangar approach, while maintaining readiness to deploy intervention techniques if opportunities presented themselves. Her assessment of the bear's behavior indicated a highly motivated animal that was focused on accessing the food sources that he had detected inside the building. The bear's willingness to approach and investigate the industrial facility demonstrated a level of boldness that exceeded normal wildlife behavior patterns. The moment of contact came at 4:07 a.m. when bear number 47 crossed the threshold of the maintenance hangar and entered the building. The massive predator paused just inside the entrance, his senses processing the overwhelming array of stimuli that defined the industrial environment. The hangar's artificial lighting created stark shadows and reflective surfaces that were unlike anything in the bear's natural habitat, while the complex odors of hydraulic fluid, metal lubricants, and human presence created an olfactory landscape that required careful interpretation. Bobby Chen watched from his elevated position as the bear entered the hangar, the reality of the situation surpassing anything that emergency training had prepared him to handle. The bear's massive size was immediately apparent in the industrial setting, where his bulk seemed to fill the available space despite the hangar's enormous dimensions. The predator's obvious intelligence and purposeful movement patterns made clear that this was not a confused animal that had wandered into unfamiliar territory, but a focused predator that had made a deliberate decision to investigate human facilities. Control. The bear is inside the hangar. Repeat, we have a large brown bear inside Maintenance Hangar 1. All personnel are in elevated positions and the bear appears to be investigating the floor area. We need immediate emergency response, Bobby transmitted, his voice maintaining professional composure despite the unprecedented nature of the situation. The bear's initial investigation of the hangar interior focused on the areas where food odors were strongest, leading him to the crew break area where remnants of dinner and snacks had created concentrated scent trails. His investigation involved significant physical interaction with furniture and equipment, including the overturning of tables and chairs as he searched for food sources. The destruction was methodical rather than random, reflecting the bear's intelligence and previous experience with human food sources. Jennifer Martinez watched from her elevated position as the bear systematically investigated the break area, his powerful claws leaving deep scratches in metal surfaces, while his bulk moved industrial furniture as if it were made of cardboard. Her military experience had provided familiarity with dangerous situations, but the current crisis represented a completely unique threat that fell outside all previous training and experience. The bear's obvious intelligence and purposeful behavior made him far more threatening than a mindless predator acting on simple instinct. The sound of the bear's investigation carried clearly throughout the hangar, creating an audio environment that was both fascinating and terrifying for the human observers. The combination of heavy breathing, occasional grunts, and the metallic sounds of claws on industrial surfaces created a soundtrack that none of the maintenance crew would ever forget. The industrial acoustics of the hangar amplified every sound, making the bear's presence impossible to ignore or minimize. Marcus Thompson found himself studying the bear's movement patterns with professional interest, despite the danger of the situation. The predator's ability to navigate the complex industrial environment demonstrated remarkable adaptability and intelligence that exceeded his previous assumptions about wildlife capabilities. However, his analysis was tempered by acute awareness of the bear's potential for violence and the vulnerability of the human personnel who were trapped in the same building. Bear number 47's investigation of the hangar interior gradually expanded beyond the immediate food source areas to include exploration of the larger facility. His curiosity about the industrial environment led him to investigate the aircraft that dominated the central area of the building, approaching the massive Boeing 747-400F with the same systematic thoroughness that he had applied to the brake area furniture. The aircraft's size and complexity appeared to fascinate the bear, who spent considerable time investigating the landing gear assemblies and external surfaces. The bear's interaction with the aircraft involved significant physical contact, including rearing up on his hind legs to investigate higher surfaces and using his claws to test various materials and components. The aircraft's construction was robust enough to withstand the bear's investigation without structural damage, but the scratches and dents left by his claws would require extensive cosmetic repair work that would cost thousands of dollars and potentially ground the aircraft for several days. Yuki Tanaka watched with professional horror as the bear investigated the aircraft that represented her primary work assignment, knowing that every scratch and dent would translate to hours of repair work and significant cost to the airline. However, her concern about property damage was secondary to the obvious danger posed by a predator that had demonstrated both the capability and willingness to breach human facilities and investigate industrial equipment with no apparent fear or respect for human presence. At 4:14 a.m., the situation escalated dramatically when Bear Number 47 detected human presence in the elevated areas of the hangar. His acute senses had been gradually processing the complex environment of the facility, and the combination of human scent and the subtle sounds of movement and breathing had eventually registered in his consciousness as potential threats or sources of interest. The bear's response to detecting human presence was immediate and focused, demonstrating the predatory instincts that had made him the apex predator of his territory. Sam Kowalski was the first crew member to attract the bear's direct attention, his position near the emergency communication equipment having provided the most visibility but also the greatest exposure to detection. The veteran mechanic found himself the subject of intense scrutiny from a predator that was clearly evaluating him as either a threat or potential prey. An experience that exceeded anything from his 3 decades of industrial work in challenging environments. Control. The bear has detected our presence and is showing direct interest in personnel locations. This animal is not afraid of humans and appears to be evaluating us as potential targets. "We need immediate emergency intervention," Sam reported, his voice reflecting the stress of someone who was experiencing direct predator attention for the first time in his life. The bear's focused attention on human presence marked a critical escalation in the developing crisis, transforming the situation from property damage and general threat to immediate danger to human life. Dr. Vasquez's protocols recognized this transition as the point where lethal intervention became not just acceptable, but necessary to protect human safety. However, the presence of personnel inside the hangar complicated any intervention strategies, as standard wildlife control techniques could not be safely deployed without risking injury to the airport workers. Bear Number 47 began actively investigating methods for reaching the elevated positions where the human personnel had taken refuge, his intelligence and problem-solving abilities becoming apparent as he studied the various ladders, stairs, and access routes that connected different levels of the hangar. The bear's systematic approach to the challenge demonstrated cognitive capabilities that exceeded the simple, instinct-driven behavior that might be expected from wildlife, making him far more dangerous than a typical predator encounter. The bear's first attempt to reach elevated areas involved investigating a mobile work platform that had been positioned near the aircraft for maintenance access. The platform's mechanical systems were not designed to support the weight and movement of an 800-pound predator, but the bear's initial testing suggested that he might be able to compromise the structure through persistence and brute force. The possibility that the bear might successfully reach human personnel transformed the situation from containment challenge to immediate life-threatening emergency. David Kim watched in growing terror as the bear investigated access routes to the elevated areas, his limited experience with Alaska wildlife providing no framework for understanding or predicting the predator's behavior. His position on the lighting access catwalk had seemed secure when he had first climbed to the elevated area, but the bear's obvious intelligence and determination made clear that no position in the hangar could be considered completely safe from a predator that was actively seeking human contact. At 4:19 a.m., emergency response personnel began arriving at the airport, with Anchorage Police Department officers being the first to reach the maintenance area. The responding officers were equipped with standard law enforcement equipment, which included firearms capable of stopping large predators, but with limited experience in wildlife encounters of this magnitude. The industrial setting of the airport created tactical challenges that were unlike typical law enforcement scenarios, requiring coordination with airport operations and wildlife management specialists. Officer Sarah Mitchell had 15 years of experience with the Anchorage Police Department, including several wildlife encounters during her career, but nothing that compared to the current situation. Her assessment of the crisis involved balancing the immediate threat to human life against the practical challenges of deploying lethal force in an industrial facility where stray bullets could cause significant property damage or endanger personnel. The hangar's metal construction created ricochet hazards that complicated any firearms deployment, requiring careful consideration of shooting angles and potential consequences. Officer James Rodriguez accompanied Officer Mitchell as part of the initial police response, bringing 10 years of law enforcement experience that included specialized training in crisis management and emergency response. His evaluation of the situation focused on establishing a secure perimeter while coordinating with other emergency response agencies to develop comprehensive intervention strategies that would minimize risk to both human personnel and responding officers. The arrival of emergency response personnel provided additional communication capabilities and coordination resources, but did not immediately resolve the crisis of a large predator that had established control of an industrial facility containing trapped human personnel. The complexity of the situation required careful planning and coordination among multiple agencies, a process that took time while the immediate danger to airport workers continued to escalate. Stephen Walker maintained his observation position at the perimeter fence, providing real-time updates on emergency response activities while continuing to monitor the overall situation from his unique vantage point. His role had evolved from routine security patrol to critical intelligence source for the developing emergency response, requiring him to balance personal safety against the need to provide accurate information about rapidly changing conditions. Bear Number 47's investigation of the hangar environment had gradually focused his attention on the elevated areas where human personnel were located, his predatory instincts recognizing the potential for accessing what he perceived as either threats or prey. The bear's approach to the challenge was systematic and persistent, demonstrating problem-solving capabilities that exceeded the simple trial-and-error methods that might be expected from wildlife encounters. His intelligence made him far more dangerous than a typical predator, as he was capable of developing and implementing strategies for overcoming obstacles. At 4:23 a.m., the bear succeeded in compromising the mobile work platform that Marcus Thompson had been using as a refuge. The platform's mechanical systems were not designed to withstand the combined weight and force applied by an 800-pound predator, and the bear's persistent investigation had identified structural weaknesses that allowed him to destabilize the equipment. The collapse of the platform created immediate danger for Marcus, while demonstrating the bear's capability to overcome human engineering through persistence and brute force. Marcus Thompson found himself in immediate danger as the work platform began to collapse beneath the bear's assault, his position transitioning from relative safety to life-threatening exposure in a matter of seconds. His experience with dangerous urban situations had provided mental preparation for crisis response, but the current threat exceeded anything from his previous experience with human dangers. The bear's obvious intelligence and focused attention made clear that escape would require immediate action and considerable luck. The platform collapse created a cascade of secondary emergencies, as other elevated positions became potentially compromised, forcing the remaining maintenance crew to reconsider their refuge locations and prepare for possible evacuation to alternative positions. The bear's demonstrated ability to compromise human engineering made clear that no position in the hangar could be considered permanently safe from a predator that was actively problem-solving methods for reaching human personnel. Bobby Chen coordinated his crew's response to the deteriorating situation, his leadership experience providing the framework for managing personnel safety during an unprecedented crisis. His assessment of available options focused on identifying alternative elevated positions while maintaining communication with emergency response personnel who were developing intervention strategies outside the hangar. The complexity of managing multiple personnel while under direct threat from a large predator exceeded any emergency training that he had received during his years of industrial work. The emergency response coordination had reached the point where lethal intervention was recognized as necessary to protect human life. But the tactical challenges of deploying firearms in the industrial environment created significant complications. Dr. Vasquez worked with law enforcement personnel to identify intervention strategies that would minimize risk to human personnel while effectively addressing the immediate threat posed by the bear. Officer Mitchell had positioned herself at the hangar entrance, where she could maintain visual contact with the bear while preparing for potential tactical deployment if safe shooting opportunities presented themselves. Her experience with firearms in crisis situations provided the technical capability for stopping a large predator. But the tactical environment of the hangar created challenges that required careful analysis and coordination with other response personnel. At 4:27 a.m., Bear number 47 made direct contact with human personnel for the first time during the crisis. Marcus Thompson's attempt to escape the collapsing work platform had brought him within range of the bear's immediate reach, creating the moment of direct confrontation that emergency responders had been working to prevent. The encounter between human and predator in the industrial environment of the hangar represented the culmination of a crisis that had escalated from routine wildlife sighting to life-threatening emergency. The bear's initial contact with Marcus Thompson was investigative rather than immediately aggressive, reflecting the predator's intelligence and assessment of the human as either potential threat or prey. However, the bear's size and strength made any physical contact inherently dangerous, as even casual interaction with an 800-pound predator could result in serious injury or death. Marcus's experience with dangerous situations provided mental preparation for crisis response, but the physical reality of direct contact with a large predator exceeded any previous experience. Officer down, officer down, we have direct human contact with the bear in the maintenance hangar. The radio transmission from Bobby Chen carried the urgency of a crisis that had transitioned from potential threat to immediate life-threatening emergency. The use of officer down terminology, while technically incorrect for civilian personnel, conveyed the seriousness of the situation in language that would trigger maximum response from emergency services. The direct contact between bear and human triggered the immediate deployment of lethal intervention strategies that had been prepared by law enforcement personnel. Officer Mitchell's position at the hangar entrance provided a shooting angle that minimized risk to other personnel while offering the potential for effective intervention to protect Marcus Thompson from immediate danger. However, the tactical complexity of the situation required split-second decisions that balanced human safety against the practical challenges of firearms deployment in an industrial setting. The first gunshot was fired at 4:28 a.m., with Officer Mitchell deploying her service weapon in an attempt to stop the bear's interaction with Marcus Thompson. The .40 caliber round struck the bear in the shoulder area, causing immediate pain and surprise that temporarily interrupted his investigation of the human, but did not immediately incapacitate the massive predator. The bear's response to being shot was a combination of pain-driven aggression and confusion, creating a more dangerous and unpredictable situation for all personnel in the immediate area. Bear number 47's reaction to being wounded transformed his behavior from curious investigation to defensive aggression, triggering predatory responses that had been honed by 15 years of survival in one of the world's most challenging environments. The bear's size and physical conditioning allowed him to absorb significant trauma while retaining the capability for violent response, making him far more dangerous than smaller predators that might be immediately incapacitated by similar wounds. Marcus Thompson found himself at the center of a life-and-death struggle with a wounded predator that possessed the size and strength to kill him with minimal effort. His survival depended on a combination of luck, the intervention of emergency response personnel, and his own ability to minimize exposure to the bear's claws and teeth during what was essentially a wrestling match with an apex predator. The industrial environment of the hangar provided both obstacles and potential tools for survival, though his ability to utilize either was limited by the immediate demands of avoiding lethal contact with the bear. Additional gunshots followed in rapid succession as Officer Rodriguez joined the intervention effort, deploying multiple rounds in an attempt to stop the bear's aggressive response to being wounded. The acoustic environment of the metal hangar amplified the gunfire to deafening levels while creating ricochet hazards that endangered all personnel in the facility. The tactical situation required immediate resolution to prevent escalation to multiple casualties among both airport personnel and emergency responders. The cumulative effect of multiple gunshot wounds eventually overcame Bear number 47's physical conditioning and survival instincts, though the process required significantly more firepower than might have been expected for stopping a large predator. The bear's exceptional size and physical condition allowed him to continue aggressive behavior despite wounds that would have immediately incapacitated smaller animals, demonstrating the inherent danger posed by apex predators when they enter direct conflict with human personnel. Bear number 47 collapsed at 4:31 a.m., succumbing to multiple gunshot wounds that had eventually overwhelmed his massive cardiovascular system. The predator's death ended the immediate threat to human personnel, but marked the beginning of a complex aftermath that would involve medical treatment for injuries, extensive property damage assessment, investigation by multiple agencies, and long-term psychological impact on everyone involved in the crisis. Marcus Thompson required immediate medical attention for injuries sustained during his direct contact with the bear, though his survival represented a remarkably fortunate outcome given the circumstances of wrestling with an 800-pound predator in an industrial environment. Emergency medical personnel who had been standing by during the crisis immediately moved to provide trauma care while preparing for transport to Providence, Alaska Medical Center, where Stephen Walker's mother, Margaret, worked as a trauma nurse. The medical assessment of Marcus Thompson's injuries revealed multiple lacerations from the bear's claws, significant bruising from impact with both the predator and industrial equipment, and potential internal injuries that required immediate diagnostic evaluation. His survival was attributed to a combination of the bear's initial investigative rather than immediately aggressive behavior, the rapid intervention by law enforcement personnel, and considerable luck in avoiding the most lethal aspects of direct contact with a large predator. Stephen Walker's role in the crisis had evolved from initial detection through ongoing intelligence support for emergency response operations, making him a critical witness to the entire sequence of events that had led to the first known fatality from a bear attack at a major North American airport. His experience and observations would prove crucial for the multi-agency investigation that would examine every aspect of the incident to determine how a large predator had successfully breached airport security and endangered personnel. The immediate aftermath of the bear attack required coordination among multiple agencies and organizations, from medical response and law enforcement to airport operations and wildlife management. Pat Sullivan found herself managing the complex logistics of maintaining airport operations while facilitating emergency response and beginning the process of assessing property damage that would eventually total several $1 million. Dr. Vasquez began the scientific investigation that would examine bear number 47's behavior patterns, physical condition, and the environmental factors that had contributed to his unprecedented boldness in approaching and breaching human facilities. Her preliminary assessment suggested that climate change effects on traditional bear behavior, combined with the individual animal's exceptional size and intelligence, had created a perfect storm of circumstances that led to the tragic encounter. The airport's operational recovery required extensive coordination to restore normal cargo operations while addressing security concerns and implementing enhanced wildlife management protocols. The maintenance hangar would require weeks of cleanup and repair work to address both bear-related damage and the effects of the law enforcement intervention that had been necessary to resolve the crisis. Jennifer Martinez, Yuki Tanaka, Sam Kowalski, David Kim, and Bobby Chen each dealt with the psychological aftermath of experiencing direct predator threat in their workplace, an encounter that would affect their approach to industrial safety and wildlife awareness for the remainder of their careers. The shared experience of survival created bonds among the crew members, while highlighting the unexpected dangers that could emerge at the intersection of human civilization and Alaska wilderness. The media response to the airport bear attack created international attention focused on the unique circumstances that had allowed a large predator to breach security at a major transportation facility. News coverage emphasized both the dramatic nature of the encounter and the broader implications for wildlife management at the interface between human infrastructure and natural habitats in Alaska. Airport security protocols underwent immediate review and enhancement, with particular attention to perimeter fence design and wildlife detection systems that could provide earlier warning of potential threats. Stephen Walker's role in the initial detection and ongoing monitoring of the crisis was recognized as exemplifying the importance of experienced security personnel who understood both facility operations and Alaska wildlife behavior. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game investigation focused on the broader implications of the incident for wildlife management policy, particularly regarding problem bears that exhibited unusual boldness around human facilities. The investigation would examine whether changes in climate, habitat availability, or human activity patterns were contributing to increased wildlife conflicts that required enhanced management strategies. Marcus Thompson's recovery process involved extensive physical therapy and psychological counseling to address both the physical trauma of his injuries and the mental impact of direct predator encounter. His experience provided valuable insight into survival strategies during wildlife attacks, while highlighting the importance of emergency response training for personnel who work in environments where wildlife encounters are possible. The aircraft that had been investigated by Bear Number 47 during his time in the hangar required extensive inspection and repair work to address cosmetic damage and ensure that no structural integrity had been compromised. The airline's insurance coverage would eventually cover most of the repair costs. But the incident highlighted the potential for wildlife encounters to create significant economic impacts on aviation operations. The legal proceedings that followed the Bear attack involved multiple jurisdictions and regulatory agencies, from workplace safety investigations by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration to airport security reviews by the Transportation Security Administration. The complexity of the incident created precedent-setting cases for liability and responsibility when wildlife encounters occur at major transportation facilities. Dr. Vasquez's comprehensive report on the incident became a cornerstone document for wildlife management policy at airports throughout North America, providing detailed analysis of the circumstances that allowed a large predator to breach facility security and recommendations for preventing similar incidents in the future. Her work emphasized the importance of understanding wildlife behavior patterns and the effects of environmental changes on traditional animal behavior. Stephen Walker received recognition for his professional conduct during the crisis, particularly his accurate reporting and continuous intelligence support that enabled effective emergency response coordination. His experience during the Bear attack led to his promotion within airport security and his development of enhanced wildlife awareness training programs for airport personnel throughout Alaska. The maintenance hangar crew's survival of the Bear encounter became a case study in emergency response and crisis management, demonstrating the importance of leadership, communication, and coordinated action during life-threatening emergencies. Bobby Chen's leadership during the crisis was recognized as exemplifying the best practices for managing personnel safety during unprecedented threats. The broader implications of the Anchorage Airport Bear attack extended to wildlife management policy throughout Alaska and other regions, where human infrastructure interfaces with large predator habitat. The incident highlighted the need for enhanced understanding of climate change effects on wildlife behavior and the development of more robust protection systems for critical infrastructure. The psychological impact of the Bear attack affected not only the directly involved personnel, but also the broader airport community, creating heightened awareness of wildlife threats and the need for enhanced preparedness for emergency situations. Counseling services were provided to all personnel who had been involved in or affected by the crisis, recognizing that exposure to life-threatening situations could have lasting mental health implications. The memorial service for Bear Number 47, organized by Dr. Vasquez and Alaska Wildlife Conservation Groups, recognized the tragic aspects of the incident while emphasizing the importance of coexistence strategies that protect both human safety and wildlife populations. The bear's death was mourned by conservationists while being recognized as necessary for protecting human life during the crisis. The anniversary of the Bear attack became an annual training exercise for airport personnel and emergency responders, using the lessons learned from the incident to improve preparedness for future wildlife encounters. The comprehensive training program developed from the Anchorage Airport incident became a model for similar facilities throughout regions where wildlife encounters represent potential threats. The long-term changes in airport operations resulting from the Bear attack included enhanced perimeter security, improved wildlife detection systems, and comprehensive training programs that prepared personnel for potential wildlife encounters. These improvements represented significant investments in safety and security that were justified by the lessons learned from the unprecedented crisis. Stephen Walker's continued career in airport security was shaped by his experience during the bear attack, leading to his specialization in wildlife threat assessment and the development of expertise that made him a valuable resource for airports throughout Alaska and other regions where wildlife encounters represent ongoing challenges to facility security and personnel safety. The scientific legacy of the Anchorage Airport bear attack provided valuable data about large predator behavior in industrial environments, contributing to research that would improve wildlife management strategies and reduce the likelihood of similar incidents in the future. The comprehensive documentation of the incident created a database of information that supported ongoing research into human-wildlife conflict resolution. The next stories. The last hunt. The morning mist clung to the Chugach Mountains like a shroud as Dr. Sarah Chen adjusted her pack straps for the third time in as many minutes. At 34, she was Alaska's youngest wildlife biologist to lead a major brown bear research project, but today, the weight of that responsibility felt heavier than her 60-pound equipment pack. The October air carried the sharp bite of approaching winter, and somewhere in these ancient peaks, the largest predators in North America were preparing for hibernation. GPS shows we're still 2 miles from the observation blind, called Marcus Reeves, her research assistant, consulting the handheld device clipped to his vest. At 26, Marcus had spent the last 3 years tracking wildlife across Alaska's most remote regions, but the Chugach always made him nervous. Too many variables, too many places for a 1,000-pound bear to appear without warning. Sarah nodded, her breath forming small clouds in the 40-degree air. We'll reach it by noon if we maintain pace. Remember, we're here to observe feeding patterns before denning season. The salmon run ended 2 weeks ago, but the bears should still be foraging for late berries and preparing dens. Behind them, the rest of the team followed in single file along the narrow game trail. Dr. James Whitaker, 62, moved with the deliberate pace of someone who had spent 40 years studying Alaskan wildlife. His grey beard was already collecting moisture from the humid air, and his weathered hands gripped his walking stick with the confidence of countless backcountry expeditions. As the senior researcher on the project, James had seen more bear encounters than anyone else on the team, and his calm presence was reassuring to the younger members. Weather Service is predicting snow tonight, announced Rebecca Torres, the team's photographer and videographer, checking her phone for the last time before they moved beyond cell range. At 29, she had documented wildlife across 6 continents, but Alaska's unpredictable weather always kept her on edge. Her cameras were sealed in waterproof cases, and spare batteries filled every available pocket in her jacket. Thomas Mitchell, their backcountry guide, brought up the rear. At 45, he had guided hunting and research expeditions throughout Alaska for over 2 decades. His knowledge of animal behavior and wilderness survival was encyclopedic, and his weathered face showed the accumulated wisdom of someone who had learned to read the subtle signs that could mean the difference between a successful expedition and disaster. Today, something felt different about the forest, though he couldn't quite articulate what was triggering his unease. The team had been planning this expedition for 8 months. Sarah's research focused on the behavioral changes in brown bears during the pre-hibernation period, specifically how climate change was affecting their traditional denning patterns. Warmer autumns meant extended feeding periods, which could disrupt the delicate timing that had evolved over thousands of years. Her preliminary data suggested that some bears were remaining active weeks longer than historical patterns indicated, and she needed direct observation to confirm her hypothesis. As they climbed higher into the Chugach, the terrain became increasingly challenging. Ancient spruce trees towered overhead, their branches creating a canopy that filtered the morning light into shifting patterns of gold and shadow. The undergrowth was thick with devil's club, blueberry bushes, and the thorny stems of rose hips that bears favored in the fall. Every few hundred yards, they encountered game trails that intersected their path, worn smooth by generations of wildlife moving between feeding areas and water sources. "Fresh scat here," Thomas called out, crouching beside a large pile of bear droppings near the trail junction. Maybe 12 hours old, based on the moisture content, large male, probably 600 pounds or more, judging by the size. He used a stick to examine the contents. Mostly berries and some fish remains. He's still feeding actively. Sarah pulled out her field notebook and recorded the GPS coordinates along with Thomas's assessment. This was exactly the kind of data she needed. Any sign of territorial marking nearby? Thomas stood and surveyed the surrounding trees. 3 claw marks on that spruce, about 8 feet up. Fresh bark scrapings. This is definitely an active corridor. He paused, tilting his head to listen to the forest sounds. "We should be extra vigilant through this section." The group continued upward, the trail becoming steeper and more treacherous with each step. Loose rocks and wet leaves created treacherous footing, and several times team members had to grab onto tree branches to maintain their balance. The sound of their footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in the morning stillness, broken only by the occasional call of ravens and the distant rush of a mountain stream. By 10:30 a.m., they had gained nearly 1,000 feet in elevation, and the forest was beginning to thin. Patches of alpine meadow appeared between stands of stunted trees, and the views back toward Anchorage were spectacular. The city appeared as a small cluster of buildings beside the vast expanse of Cook Inlet, dwarfed by the surrounding peaks that stretched to the horizon in every direction. "Break time," Sarah announced, finding a flat area beside a small stream where the team could rest and refuel. They had been hiking for 3 hours, and everyone was feeling the effects of the steep terrain and high altitude. Granola bars and water bottles appeared from various packs, and conversation was minimal as they focused on replenishing their energy. Rebecca used the break to check her camera equipment and capture some establishing shots of their route. The light filtering through the forest canopy created dramatic contrasts that would work well in the final documentation of their research. She had already filled one memory card with images of the terrain, wildlife signs, and candid shots of the team members at work. "Thomas, what's your assessment of bear activity in this immediate area?" Dr. Whitaker asked, joining the guide beside the stream. James had worked with Thomas on several previous expeditions, and he valued the man's intimate knowledge of local wildlife patterns. "Higher than normal for this time of year," Thomas replied, refilling his water bottle from the clear mountain stream. "Usually by mid-October, most bears are focused on den preparation, but we've seen sign of at least 3 different animals in the last mile, all actively foraging. Sarah's theory about extended activity periods might be more accurate than we thought." Sarah looked up from her field notes. "That's consistent with the preliminary data from our radio-collared bears. 2 of our tagged females haven't even begun excavating their dens, and it's October 15th. Historically, they would have been in their dens for 2 weeks by now." The implications were significant. If climate change was disrupting hibernation patterns, it could affect everything from reproductive cycles to food availability. Bears that remained active longer required more calories, which increased competition for resources and potential conflicts with humans. Sarah's research could provide crucial data for wildlife management decisions throughout the region. After 30 minutes, they resumed their ascent toward the observation blind. The structure had been built 3 years earlier by a previous research team, positioned to overlook a natural meadow where bears frequently foraged. It was elevated 12 feet off the ground and constructed of pressure-treated lumber designed to withstand Alaska's harsh weather conditions. Solar panels provided power for basic equipment, and the interior was equipped with recording devices, cameras, and a small propane heater. The final mile to the blind required negotiating a series of switchbacks carved into an increasingly steep slope. The trail was barely wide enough for single-file passage, with drop-offs of several hundred feet on the downhill side. Ancient rock slides had left the path scattered with loose stones that shifted underfoot, and progress slowed to a careful crawl as each team member concentrated on secure footing. "I can see the blind," Marcus called out from the front of the group, pointing to a wooden structure barely visible through the trees about 300 yards ahead. "Looks intact from here." The sight of their destination provided a psychological boost to the tired team. They had been hiking for nearly 4 hours, and the combination of altitude, steep terrain, and heavy packs was taking its toll on everyone. The promise of a solid structure with basic amenities seemed like luxury after the challenging ascent. As they approached the final approach to the blind, Thomas suddenly stopped and raised his hand for silence. The entire team froze on the narrow trail, pack frames creaking as they adjusted to the sudden halt. In the wilderness, such signals were never ignored, and everyone strained their senses to detect whatever had triggered the guide's alert. For nearly a minute, they stood motionless, listening to the subtle sounds of the forest. Wind rustled through the spruce needles overhead. A woodpecker hammered against a distant tree. Water trickled over rocks in a hidden stream. Then, carried on a slight breeze, came a sound that made every member of the team's blood run cold. The deep, rumbling vocalization of a very large brown bear. The sound came from somewhere ahead of them, in the direction of the observation blind. It wasn't the warning huff that bears sometimes made when startled by humans. This was something else entirely, a low, continuous growl that spoke of territoriality and barely controlled aggression. Thomas had heard similar vocalizations only a few times in his career, usually from large males defending a carcass or a female with cubs protecting her offspring. Sarah felt her heart rate spike as she recognized the implications. They were still several hundred yards from the blind, on a narrow trail with limited options for retreat. If there was indeed a large bear near their destination, they would need to make some difficult decisions about how to proceed. "Options," she whispered to Thomas, who was scanning the terrain ahead with practiced eyes. "We wait," he replied quietly. "Could be just passing through. But if it's defending something near the blind, we may need to consider alternative plans." The team remained frozen on the trail as Thomas tried to assess their situation. The blind was positioned on the edge of a natural meadow that bears used as a feeding area, which meant they might be dealing with an animal protecting what it considered its territory. On the other hand, the vocalization could have been directed at another bear, or even triggered by something else entirely. Without visual contact, it was impossible to determine the animal's location, size, or intentions. After 10 minutes of silence, Dr. Whitaker moved carefully up beside Thomas. "What's your recommendation? We've got limited daylight to establish our observation post and collect baseline data." Thomas continued studying the terrain ahead. The trail curved around a rock outcropping before opening into the meadow where the blind was located. From their current position, they had no visual contact with the area, which meant they were effectively hiking blind into potentially dangerous territory. His experience suggested caution, but he also understood the scientific importance of the team's mission. "We proceed, but with maximum alertness," he decided. "Single file, minimum noise. If we encounter the bear, we group together, make ourselves appear large, and back away slowly. Nobody runs unless I give the signal, and then we move uphill. Bears are slower climbing than descending." The team checked their bear spray, ensuring the canisters were easily accessible and the safety clips removed. Each person carried 2 cans, one on their hip and a backup in their pack. They had practiced deployment procedures during training sessions, but actual encounters were entirely different from controlled exercises. Moving with exaggerated care, they resumed their approach toward the blind. Every step was placed deliberately, avoiding loose rocks and dry branches that might create noise. Communication was limited to essential hand signals, and everyone's eyes continuously scanned the surrounding forest for movement or other signs of wildlife presence. The trail curved around the rock outcropping, and suddenly the meadow opened before them. It was a natural clearing of perhaps 2 acres, surrounded by dense forest and dotted with the stumps of trees that had been felled by previous avalanches. The observation blind stood at the far edge, exactly as they remembered from the planning photographs. But something was immediately apparent that explained the vocalizations they had heard earlier. In the center of the meadow, partially hidden by tall grass, lay the carcass of what appeared to be a moose. Even from a distance of several hundred yards, they could see that it was relatively fresh, probably killed within the last day or two. Steam rose from the exposed meat in the cold morning air, and the distinctive sweet smell of death was beginning to permeate the area. "That's our problem," Thomas murmured. "Some bear has claimed that carcass, and he won't want to share." A moose carcass represented an enormous food source for a bear, potentially providing thousands of calories that could make the difference between successful hibernation and starvation. Any bear that had claimed such a prize would defend it aggressively against all perceived threats, including humans. The team was effectively looking at a scenario that wilderness guides considered among the most dangerous possible encounters. Sarah studied the scene through her binoculars, trying to spot any sign of the bear that had presumably made the kill. "I don't see any movement around the carcass. Could the bear have left to rest and digest?" "Possible, but unlikely," Thomas replied. "More probable that he's bedded down somewhere with a good view of his prize, could be anywhere within a few hundred yards." He gestured toward the surrounding forest, where dozens of potential hiding spots offered concealment for a large predator. The team faced a critical decision. They could retreat and abandon their research mission, potentially wasting months of planning and preparation. Or they could attempt to reach the blind while avoiding the area around the carcass, hoping that the bear would tolerate their presence as long as they didn't threaten his food source. Neither option was particularly appealing. Dr. Whitaker, as the senior researcher, ultimately had responsibility for the team's safety. His 4 decades of fieldwork had taught him to err on the side of caution, but he also understood the scientific value of their mission. Climate change research required data from situations exactly like this, where normal patterns were being disrupted by environmental factors. "We try for the blind," he decided, "but we take a wide detour around the carcass, maximum possible distance, while still reaching our destination. If we encounter the bear at any point, we immediately retreat." The revised plan required leaving the established trail and bushwhacking through dense forest for nearly half a mile. It would be slow, difficult, and potentially noisy, but it offered the best compromise between safety and mission success. Thomas would lead, followed by Sarah, then Marcus, Rebecca, and Dr. Whitaker bringing up the rear. They left the trail at the rock outcropping and began working their way through the forest parallel to the meadow. The undergrowth was thick with berry bushes, fallen logs, and the tangled branches of devil's club that seemed designed to catch on clothing and equipment. Progress was measured in yards rather than miles, and every step required careful consideration of foot placement and route selection. The forest floor was a carpet of fallen leaves, moss, and decaying organic matter that muffled their footsteps but created other challenges. Hidden rocks and deadfall threatened to trip the unwary, and several times team members had to stop and untangle themselves from thorny bushes or low-hanging branches. The heavy packs made it difficult to duck under obstacles or squeeze through narrow gaps between trees, After an hour of bushwhacking, they had covered perhaps 300 yards and were beginning to angle back toward the meadow where the blind was located. The going was getting easier as they moved into more mature forest with less dense undergrowth, but everyone was exhausted from the physical demands of off-trail travel with heavy loads. Blind should be directly ahead, maybe 200 yards, Thomas whispered, consulting his GPS unit. They were approaching the structure from the backside, which would require crossing a small creek and climbing a steep embankment to reach the elevated platform. As they worked their way through the final section of forest, Rebecca suddenly grabbed Sarah's arm and pointed toward a cluster of trees about 50 yards to their left. At first, Sarah saw nothing unusual, just the typical patterns of light and shadow created by the forest canopy. Then her eyes adjusted, and she realized what had caught Rebecca's attention. Partially concealed behind the trunk of a massive spruce tree, the distinctive brown bulk of a very large bear was visible. The animal appeared to be resting, possibly sleeping, but positioned where it had a clear line of sight to the moose carcass in the meadow. It was impossible to determine the exact size from their current distance, but even lying down, the bear appeared enormous. Thomas had spotted it as well and was already signaling for the team to freeze. They were downwind from the animal, which meant their scent wouldn't immediately alert it to their presence, but any movement or sound could trigger a response that none of them wanted to experience. The bear was positioned almost directly between their current location and the observation blind, making it impossible to reach their destination without passing uncomfortably close to the predator. For several minutes they remained motionless, hoping the bear might move away from the area. Occasionally, they could see its head lift slightly as it scanned the surrounding forest, but it showed no indication of leaving its strategic position overlooking the carcass. The animal was clearly alert, despite its resting posture, and any approach would almost certainly result in a confrontation. Sarah felt a growing sense of frustration as she watched their carefully planned research mission falling apart. The data they needed was literally within sight. The observation blind was less than 200 yards away, but might as well have been on the moon given the current circumstances. She began considering alternative strategies that might allow them to complete at least part of their objectives. "What if we set up a temporary observation post from here?" she whispered to Thomas. "We can't reach the blind, but we might be able to document the bear's behavior around the carcass." Thomas considered the suggestion while keeping his eyes fixed on the massive predator. They had a clear view of both the bear and the moose carcass, and the distance was sufficient to ensure they wouldn't interfere with the animal's natural behavior patterns. It wasn't the controlled environment they had planned, but it might actually provide better data about natural feeding behavior. "Could work," he agreed quietly, "but we'd need to maintain this position for several hours, and we don't know how the bear will react if it discovers us." Dr. Whitaker joined the whispered discussion. "From a research standpoint, this could actually be ideal. We're observing completely natural behavior without the artificial influence of a blind or feeding station. Sarah, what do you think?" Sarah weighed the risks and benefits. They were relatively safe at their current distance, especially with the wind direction in their favor. The bear appeared focused on the carcass rather than actively hunting, which reduced the likelihood of aggressive behavior. And they would be collecting exactly the type of behavioral data that her research required. "Let's try it," she decided. "But we establish clear retreat routes and maintain constant communication. If the bear shows any sign of moving in our direction, we implement emergency procedures immediately." The team carefully selected observation positions that provided good sight lines while remaining concealed behind trees and undergrowth. Rebecca set up her camera equipment with telephoto lenses that would allow detailed documentation from their current distance. Marcus prepared the GPS units and data recording equipment, while Dr. Whitaker organized the field notebooks and observation protocols they would need. For the next hour, they maintained their improvised observation post, documenting the bear's behavior and activity patterns. The animal alternated between resting periods and brief feeding sessions at the moose carcass, following patterns that were consistent with Sarah's hypotheses about extended autumn activity. The bear appeared to be in excellent condition, probably weighing well over 700 pounds, and showed none of the urgency typically associated with pre-hibernation feeding. At 2:15 p.m., the bear's behavior suddenly changed. The animal lifted its head and began testing the air with obvious intensity, rotating its massive skull to sample scents from different directions. After several minutes of this behavior, it rose to its feet, revealing its true size for the first time. Even at a distance of 50 yards, the bear appeared enormous, easily one of the largest brown bears any of the team members had ever seen. "That's a monster," Thomas whispered, his voice carrying a mixture of awe and concern. "Probably 8 feet tall at the shoulder, maybe 900 pounds. That's a dominant male in his prime." The bear began moving slowly around the meadow, pausing frequently to test the air and examine the ground. Its behavior suggested it had detected something that warranted investigation, though it wasn't displaying the aggressive postures associated with perceived threats. Instead, it seemed curious about some scent or sound that had captured its attention. Sarah watched through her binoculars as the massive predator systematically worked its way around the perimeter of the meadow. The animal's movements were surprisingly graceful for something so large, flowing across the uneven terrain with the fluid efficiency of a creature perfectly adapted to its environment. She found herself simultaneously terrified and fascinated by the display of natural power and intelligence. "It's definitely searching for something," she whispered to the rest of the team. "The question is whether it's detected us or some other stimulus." As if in response to her comment, the bear suddenly stopped and looked directly toward their hiding place. For several heart-stopping seconds, the animal remained motionless, its small, dark eyes apparently focused on their location. Then it began moving in their direction with deliberate, purposeful steps that left no doubt about its intentions. "Time to go," Thomas announced, abandoning all pretense of whispered communication. "Emergency retreat protocol, uphill, stay together." The team had rehearsed this scenario during their safety training, but actual implementation was far more challenging than controlled exercises. Heavy packs that had seemed manageable during normal hiking suddenly felt like enormous burdens that threatened to throw them off balance with every step. The undergrowth that they had carefully navigated during their approach now became a maze of obstacles that caught on clothing and equipment. Behind them, they could hear the bear crashing through the forest in pursuit. The sound was unlike anything most of them had experienced. The rhythmic thunder of massive paws striking the ground, combined with the splintering of branches and the rustle of displaced vegetation. It was the sound of 800 pounds of muscle and bone moving at speeds that seemed impossible for something so large. Thomas led the retreat up the steep slope behind their observation post, following a rough game trail that offered the most direct route away from the bear. The terrain was treacherous, with loose rocks and exposed roots that threatened to trip the unwary, but it was their best option for putting distance between themselves and the pursuing predator. "Don't look back, just climb," Thomas shouted over his shoulder as he heard someone stumbling behind him. "Bears are faster than you think on level ground, but they struggle with steep uphill." Sarah felt her legs burning as she fought to maintain pace with the group. The combination of altitude, heavy pack, and pure adrenaline was pushing her cardiovascular system to its limits. But the sound of the bear crashing through the forest below provided powerful motivation to continue. She could hear her own breathing becoming labored, but forced herself to focus on Thomas's boots just ahead of her. Behind her, Marcus was struggling with his pack, which had shifted during the initial moments of the retreat and was now throwing off his center of gravity. Rebecca was maintaining better pace, her years of wilderness photography having prepared her for exactly this type of emergency situation. Dr. Whitaker, despite his age, was keeping up through sheer determination and 4 decades of fieldwork experience. The bear's pursuit sounds were gradually fading as they gained elevation, but Thomas continued pushing the pace until they had climbed nearly 500 vertical feet above the meadow. Only then did he allow a brief halt to assess their situation and ensure that everyone was accounted for and uninjured. "Everyone okay?" he gasped, checking each team member for obvious injuries or signs of distress. Any twisted ankles, pulled muscles, equipment problems. The team took inventory of themselves and their gear. Marcus had suffered some scratches from thorny bushes, and Rebecca had lost her backup lens cap during the retreat, but everyone was essentially unharmed. More importantly, they were now at sufficient elevation and distance that pursuit by the bear was highly unlikely. Sarah looked back down the slope toward the meadow, now partially visible through the forest canopy. The bear had returned to the area around the moose carcass and appeared to have lost interest in following them further. Its message had been delivered. This was its territory, and intruders were not welcome. "So much for our research mission," Marcus commented, still breathing heavily from the climb. "What do we do now?" Thomas consulted his map and GPS unit. "We're about a mile northeast of the original blind location. There's another trail that connects to the main hiking route about 2 miles from here. If we follow the ridgeline, we can work our way back to the parking area without going anywhere near our furry friend." Dr. Whitaker was already considering the scientific implications of their encounter. "Actually, this might have been more valuable than our planned observation session. We documented a large male actively defending a kill site in mid-October, which is exactly the kind of behavioral data Sarah needs for her climate change research." Sarah nodded, though she was still processing the adrenaline rush from their close encounter. The extended activity period, the aggressive territorial behavior, the excellent body condition, it all supports the hypothesis that warming temperatures are disrupting traditional hibernation patterns. As they prepared to continue their retreat along the ridgeline, Rebecca was reviewing the footage she had captured during their observation period. Despite the abbreviated session, she had managed to record nearly an hour of the bear's behavior around the carcass, including the dramatic pursuit sequence that had ended their research day. "I got some incredible material," she announced, scrolling through the digital images on her camera's LCD screen. "The telephoto shots of the bear feeding are exactly what we need for documentation, and the pursuit sequence is intense." The team began the long hike back to their vehicles, following a route that would take them well clear of the bear's territory. The afternoon sun was beginning to sink toward the western peaks, and they needed to reach the parking area before darkness made navigation dangerous. The adrenaline from their encounter was gradually wearing off, replaced by the fatigue of a long day in challenging terrain. As they walked, Sarah reflected on the implications of what they had witnessed. The bear they had encountered represented everything she was researching: the disruption of traditional patterns, the extension of active periods, the increased competition for resources that could lead to more frequent encounters with humans. It was a living example of how climate change was affecting one of Alaska's most iconic species. "Thomas, how often do you see bears that size still actively feeding this late in October?" she asked as they navigated a particularly steep section of trail. "5 years ago, almost never," he replied, "but it's becoming more common. The old-timers used to say that all the big males would be in their dens by the first week of October. Now we're seeing active bears well into November, sometimes even December." The implications were sobering. If large predators were remaining active longer, it increased the potential for conflicts with humans during hunting season, late-season hiking, and other outdoor activities. Wildlife management agencies would need to adjust their protocols and public education programs to account for these changing patterns. They reached the main hiking trail as the sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red. The familiar route felt like a highway compared to the bushwhacking they had endured earlier in the day, and everyone's pace quickened as they anticipated reaching their vehicles and the safety of civilization. "Next time we plan a research expedition, we're bringing a helicopter," Marcus commented, adjusting his pack straps for the final descent to the parking area. "This ground-level approach to bear research is getting a little too exciting for my taste." Sarah laughed, though she was already beginning to plan modifications for future research efforts. "Actually, this encounter provided exactly the kind of data we need. We just need to develop better safety protocols for observing bears that are defending resources." By 7:30 p.m., they reached the parking area where their vehicles waited. The familiar sight of their trucks represented the successful conclusion of what had started as a routine research expedition but had evolved into something far more dramatic. As they loaded their equipment and prepared for the drive back to Anchorage, each team member was processing the day's events in their own way. Dr. Whitaker was already considering how to incorporate their observations into the broader research project. The behavioral data they had collected, though abbreviated, provided compelling evidence for the disruption of traditional patterns that Sarah's research was designed to document. Their encounter would become a case study in how climate change was affecting wildlife behavior in measurable ways. Rebecca was reviewing her footage, identifying the best images for documentation and potential publication. The photographs of the massive bear feeding at the moose carcass would provide powerful visual evidence to accompany the scientific data they had collected. The pursuit sequence, while terrifying to experience, would serve as a dramatic illustration of the changing dynamics between humans and wildlife in Alaska. Thomas was already planning modifications for future expeditions to similar locations. Their experience had highlighted the need for better reconnaissance techniques, alternative observation methods, and enhanced safety protocols when working in areas with high bear density. The wilderness guide business was evolving as climate change altered traditional wildlife patterns, and successful operators would need to adapt their strategies accordingly. As they drove back toward Anchorage, the city lights gradually appearing in the distance, Sarah felt a complex mixture of exhaustion, exhilaration, and professional satisfaction. The day had not proceeded according to plan, but it had provided exactly the kind of real-world data that her research required. Climate change was not an abstract concept when you were staring at a 900-pound bear that should have been hibernating, but was instead actively defending territory in mid-October. The following morning, back in her office at the University of Alaska, Sarah began the process of analyzing and documenting their field observations. The data they had collected would contribute to a growing body of research, demonstrating how warming temperatures were affecting wildlife behavior throughout Alaska. Her preliminary findings suggested that the changes were more dramatic and far-reaching than many experts had predicted. The bear they had encountered represented more than just a single data point in a scientific study. It was a living symbol of how Alaska's wilderness was adapting to changing environmental conditions, often in ways that created new challenges for both wildlife and humans. The encounter had provided a vivid illustration of why research like theirs was essential for understanding and preparing for the continuing impacts of climate change. Over the following weeks, Sarah worked to incorporate their field observations into her broader research project. The behavioral patterns they had documented were consistent with data from other research sites throughout Alaska. painting a picture of significant disruption to traditional wildlife cycles. Bears that remained active longer required more food, which increased competition for resources and altered territorial behaviors. The implications extended far beyond academic research. Wildlife management agencies would need to adjust their policies and recommendations based on these changing patterns. Public education programs would need to emphasize that traditional assumptions about bear behavior were no longer reliable guides for outdoor safety. The wilderness tourism industry would need to adapt their practices to account for extended periods of bear activity. Thomas incorporated their experience into the safety training he provided to other wilderness guides and research teams. The encounter had reinforced several important principles about bear safety while highlighting new challenges created by changing behavioral patterns. His recommendations emphasized the need for enhanced situational awareness and more conservative safety protocols when working in bear habitat during transitional seasons. Rebecca's documentation of their expedition received wide attention from both scientific and popular publications. Her photographs provided compelling visual evidence of the behavioral changes that researchers were documenting across Alaska. The images of the massive bear feeding in mid-October served as powerful illustrations of how climate change was affecting wildlife in measurable, observable ways. Dr. Whitaker used their field experience as a case study in his graduate courses on wildlife ecology and field research methods. The expedition had provided his students with a real-world example of how field research rarely proceeds according to plan, and how scientists must adapt their methods to changing environmental conditions. Their encounter had become a teaching tool for understanding the complex relationships between climate change, wildlife behavior, and human safety. Marcus completed his graduate degree using data from their expedition and subsequent research. His thesis examined the correlation between temperature patterns and bear activity levels, using their field observations as supporting evidence for broader climate trends. The work contributed to a growing understanding of how warming temperatures were affecting wildlife behavior throughout the Arctic and subarctic regions. 1 year later, Sarah returned to the same area to continue her research, this time with modified protocols that reflected lessons learned from their initial encounter. The observation blind had been relocated to a less vulnerable position, and new safety procedures had been implemented based on their previous experience. The research continued, but with greater awareness of the changing dynamics between humans and wildlife in Alaska's warming climate. The bear they had encountered that October day remained in the area throughout the following summer, becoming a regular subject of their ongoing research. Camera traps and GPS collar data revealed that the massive male had indeed altered his traditional patterns, remaining active weeks longer than historical data suggested was normal for animals of his size and age. He had become a living laboratory for understanding how climate change was affecting one of North America's most iconic predators. Their research contributed to policy changes at the state and federal level as wildlife management agencies incorporated new data about changing bear behavior into their management plans. Public education programs were updated to reflect the reality that traditional assumptions about wildlife patterns were no longer reliable. The work had immediate practical applications for anyone who lived, worked, or recreated in bear country. Sarah's research was ultimately published in several peer-reviewed journals, contributing to the scientific understanding of how climate change was affecting wildlife behavior throughout Alaska. The field observations from their encounter with the massive brown bear provided crucial supporting data for broader studies of climate impacts on Arctic and subarctic ecosystems. The story of their encounter became part of Alaska wilderness lore, retold by guides and researchers as an example of how quickly situations could change in bear country. It served as a reminder that even experienced professionals needed to maintain constant vigilance and be prepared to adapt their plans when faced with the unpredictable behavior of large predators. Years later, when Sarah reflected on that October day in the Chugach Mountains, she recognized it as a turning point in both her career and her understanding of how climate change was affecting Alaska's wildlife. The encounter had provided her with first-hand experience of the dynamic, unpredictable nature of a wilderness in transition, where traditional patterns were being disrupted by environmental changes that were still not fully understood. The massive brown bear they had encountered that day had served as both subject and teacher, providing scientific data while delivering a powerful lesson about the need for respect, caution, and adaptability when working in Alaska's changing wilderness. It had been a reminder that in the relationship between humans and wildlife, the animals would always have the final say about the terms of engagement. Their expedition had begun as a routine scientific mission, but had evolved into something more significant, a first-hand encounter with the reality of climate change, as experienced by one of Alaska's most powerful predators. The bear had been a living embodiment of the disrupted patterns and altered behaviors that their research was designed to document and understand. The experience had reinforced Sarah's commitment to her research while providing her with a deeper appreciation for the complexity and unpredictability of the systems she was studying. Climate change was not an abstract concept when you were staring at a 900-pound bear that should have been hibernating, but was instead actively defending territory in conditions that would have been unprecedented just a generation earlier. As Alaska continued to warm at twice the global average, encounters like theirs would likely become more common. The research they had conducted, dangerous as it had been, provided essential data for understanding and preparing for a future where the traditional boundaries between human and wildlife activities were becoming increasingly blurred. The massive brown bear they had encountered remained a symbol of Alaska's wild power and unpredictability, a reminder that despite all human technology and knowledge, the wilderness still held the ultimate authority over those who chose to enter its domain. Their encounter had been a privilege as much as a challenge, an opportunity to witness firsthand the magnificent and terrifying reality of one of North America's most formidable predators. In the end, their abbreviated research expedition had provided exactly what they had come looking for, data about how climate change was affecting wildlife behavior in Alaska. They had just collected it in a more dramatic fashion than anyone had anticipated, creating memories and scientific observations that would last a lifetime and contribute to humanity's understanding of a rapidly changing world. The next stories. The Last Bridge. The wind howled across the tundra with a ferocity that Marcus Chen had never experienced in his 32 years of wilderness photography. Even through his military-grade sleeping bag and insulated bivouac, the cold seeped into his bones like liquid nitrogen, making sleep nearly impossible beneath the abandoned railway bridge outside Kaktovik, Alaska. The bridge, a rusted iron skeleton from the failed Trans-Alaska pipeline expansion of the 1970s, provided minimal shelter from the Arctic gale, but it was the only protection for miles across the barren landscape. Marcus had arrived in Kaktovik 3 days earlier on assignment for National Geographic, documenting the changing migration patterns of polar bears as climate change pushed them further inland in search of food. The assignment was supposed to be straightforward: capture images of bears scavenging along the coast, interview local Inupiat hunters about behavioral changes they'd observed, and return to Anchorage within a week. But Marcus had always been driven by an obsession with the perfect shot, the image that would define his career and separate him from the countless other wildlife photographers competing for magazine spreads and gallery exhibitions. The bridge had caught his attention on his second day in the village. Local guide Thomas Kanguk, a weathered Inupiat man in his 60s, whose family had hunted these lands for generations, had warned Marcus against venturing near the structure. Nanook comes there, Thomas had said, using the traditional name for polar bear. Young males, hungry ones, they smell everything. Food, soap, even the metal of the bridge holds scents. You don't sleep there, photographer man. You want pictures? We find safer places. But Marcus had seen the artistic potential immediately. The bridge's dramatic silhouette against the endless Arctic sky, the way morning light filtered through its steel framework, the symbolic resonance of abandoned human infrastructure slowly being reclaimed by nature. It was exactly the kind of environmental storytelling that editors craved. More importantly, he'd noticed fresh polar bear tracks in the snow near the bridge's southern approach, massive paw prints that suggested a large male had been using the area regularly. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a marine biologist from the University of Alaska who was conducting concurrent research on polar bear feeding habits, had tried to dissuade him as well. She'd been working in the Arctic for over 15 years, studying how warming temperatures were forcing polar bears to adapt their hunting strategies and expand their territorial ranges. The bears here aren't like the ones further south, she'd explained over dinner at the village's only restaurant, a cramped building that served as both diner and community gathering place. These animals are desperate. The sea ice is forming later each year. Their traditional hunting grounds are disappearing. A hungry polar bear will investigate anything that might be food, and a sleeping human under a bridge represents an easy target. Sarah was 41 years old, originally from New Mexico, and had come to Alaska after completing her doctorate at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. She was compact and athletic, with prematurely grey hair that she kept pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she possessed the kind of quiet authority that came from years of working in dangerous environments. Her research station was a temporary installation about 8 miles inland from Kaktovik, where she and her 2 graduate assistants were monitoring polar bear movement patterns using satellite collar data and trail cameras. Marcus had met Sarah through Thomas, who served as a guide for both of their research projects. The 3 of them had formed an unlikely partnership over the past few days, Thomas providing traditional ecological knowledge passed down through generations, Sarah contributing scientific methodology and equipment, and Marcus documenting their work through his camera lens. But Marcus's artistic ambitions often put him at odds with the others' cautious approach to Arctic wildlife. The 3rd member of their informal group was Elena Rostova, a Russian climatologist who had arrived in Kaktovik 6 months earlier as part of an international Arctic research initiative. Elena was 28 years old, fluent in 5 languages, and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of Arctic weather patterns that proved invaluable for predicting animal behavior. She had grown up in Siberia and understood the brutal realities of polar environments in ways that even Sarah, despite her years of experience, sometimes found humbling. Elena had been the most vocal in her opposition to Marcus's plan to camp near the bridge. "In Siberia we have saying," she told him in her accented English. "The bear who eats man is bear who has forgotten fear. These bears, they lose fear because they have no choice. Climate change makes them desperate, and desperate bear is most dangerous bear." The bridge itself was approximately 200 yards long and 40 feet high, spanning a seasonal creek that had carved a shallow gorge through the permafrost. The structure dated back to 1976, part of an ambitious but ultimately failed project to extend petroleum pipeline infrastructure further north along Alaska's Arctic coast. When crude oil prices collapsed in the early 1980s, the project was abandoned, leaving behind scattered infrastructure that was gradually being consumed by the harsh Arctic environment. Marcus had spent considerable time researching the bridge's history, partly for his own curiosity and partly because National Geographic editors loved historical context in environmental stories. The bridge had been constructed by Bechtel Corporation using steel fabricated in Pittsburgh and shipped north during the brief Arctic shipping season. Original construction crews had worked in brutal conditions, with temperatures regularly dropping below -40 degrees Fahrenheit and winds exceeding 60 miles per hour. 3 workers had died during construction, one from hypothermia, one from a fall, and one in a machinery accident that local records suggested might have involved a polar bear encounter, though official reports listed the cause of death as equipment malfunction. The area around the bridge showed clear signs of regular polar bear activity. Marcus had documented dozens of tracks in the snow, ranging from small prints left by juveniles to massive impressions indicating mature males weighing potentially over 1,000 pounds. The bears appeared to use the bridge area as a travel corridor, following the creek bed as they moved between coastal hunting areas and inland denning sites. Most significantly, Marcus had discovered a partially consumed caribou carcass about 300 yards from the bridge, suggesting that at least one large bear was actively hunting in the immediate vicinity. Thomas had explained that the bridge's location placed it directly along what local hunters called the Ghost Trail, a traditional polar bear migration route that had been used for centuries but was becoming increasingly unpredictable as environmental changes disrupted normal patterns. "My grandfather's grandfather hunted this trail," Thomas had said. "Always the bears come here when ice breaks early, but now they come angry, hungry, different than before." And the bear that would ultimately change all their lives was a mature male designated PB447 in Sarah's research database. She had been tracking him for 6 months using satellite collar data, and his movement patterns revealed a disturbing trend. Unlike most polar bears, who maintained relatively consistent territorial ranges, PB447 had been expanding his territory steadily southward, following the retreating ice edge, but also exploring inland areas that polar bears had historically avoided. PB447 was estimated to be between 12 and 15 years old, placing him in the prime of his life, but also at an age where increased energy demands made finding adequate food supplies increasingly critical. Satellite data indicated that he weighed approximately 1,100 pounds, larger than average, but not exceptionally so for a mature male. What made him unusual was his apparent lack of wariness around human activity. Most polar bears detected human presence from considerable distances and actively avoided contact, but PB447 had repeatedly approached research installations, hunting camps, and even the outskirts of villages. Sarah's research notes, which she shared with Marcus, despite her reservations about his camping plans, painted a picture of an animal under extreme stress. PB447's movement patterns showed that he was traveling much greater distances than typical polar bears, sometimes covering over 50 miles in a single day. His hunting success rate, calculated based on time spent at breathing holes and satellite data indicating extended stationary periods consistent with successful kills, was well below average. Most concerning, collar data showed that he had been actively investigating human-associated scents, spending extended periods near abandoned equipment caches, old hunting camps, and areas where research teams had been working. The bridge represented exactly the kind of location that PB447 had been drawn to repeatedly, a structure that concentrated both human scents and potential food odors, providing shelter that might trap and intensify these attractants. Sarah's trail cameras had captured images of PB447 near similar structures on 3 separate occasions over the past month, and in each case, the bear had exhibited unusually bold behavior, approaching within yards of the cameras and investigating them extensively. Marcus understood the risks intellectually, but his artistic vision overshadowed his caution. He had already secured several powerful images during his time in Kaktovik. A mother polar bear with two cubs silhouetted against the midnight sun, a large male stalking seals along pressure ridges in the sea ice, the ethereal beauty of the aurora borealis reflecting off the snow-covered tundra. But none of these images possessed the narrative power he was seeking, the kind of photograph that would anchor a major magazine feature and potentially win international recognition. The bridge offered that potential. Marcus envisioned a series of images that would tell the story of climate change through the lens of abandoned human infrastructure being reclaimed by nature. The rusted steel framework would serve as a metaphor for humanity's failed attempts to dominate the Arctic environment, while the presence of polar bears in the area would illustrate how these apex predators were being forced to adapt to rapidly changing conditions. It was exactly the kind of environmental storytelling that had made photographers like Joel Sartore and Paul Nicklin international celebrities. On the evening before his fateful decision to camp under the bridge, Marcus had joined Sarah, Elena, and Thomas for dinner at Thomas's home, a modest prefabricated house that his family had lived in for over 20 years. Thomas's wife, Mary, prepared fresh Arctic char that Thomas had caught through the ice earlier that week, along with traditional accompaniments including dried caribou meat and cloudberries preserved from the brief summer harvest. The conversation that evening would later be remembered by all three survivors as a final attempt to change Marcus's mind about his dangerous camping plan. Elena had brought weather data showing that temperatures were expected to drop to -35 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind gusts exceeding 40 miles per hour. Sarah presented her most recent satellite tracking data, which showed that PB447 had been detected less than 2 miles from the bridge just 12 hours earlier, moving in a pattern that suggested active hunting behavior. Thomas spoke with the kind of quiet authority that came from decades of experience reading the subtle signs that distinguished safe conditions from deadly ones. "Weather comes tomorrow like angry spirit," he said, gesturing toward the window where snow was already beginning to accumulate. "This kind of wind, it carries scents very far. Bear smells you from many miles, follows scent like trail. Under bridge, wind makes tunnels, carries your smell in all directions." Mary, who rarely spoke during these research discussions, added her own perspective with characteristic directness. "My grandfather tells stories of bears who hunt men like seals. Always start same way. Man thinks he knows better than land, than weather, than bear. Land teaches him different." But Marcus remained convinced that his precautions would be sufficient. He had invested in the highest quality cold weather gear available, including a sleeping system rated for temperatures down to -50 degrees Fahrenheit. His campsite would include motion-activated lights, an air horn for deterring wildlife, and a satellite communication device for emergency contact. Most importantly, he planned to suspend his food and toiletries at least 15 feet off the ground, well beyond the reach of any bear. What Marcus failed to fully appreciate was that polar bears are fundamentally different from other North American bear species in their relationship with humans. Black bears and grizzly bears, despite their potential for dangerous encounters, generally view humans as threats to be avoided. Polar bears, by contrast, are apex predators that have never evolved a natural fear of humans. In their Arctic environment, polar bears sit at the absolute top of the food chain, and they approach any potential food source, including humans, with the confidence of animals that have no natural enemies. Dr. Ian Sterling, whose research Sarah had studied extensively during her graduate work, had documented this fundamental difference in polar bear behavior in his landmark studies of human-bear interactions. Unlike other bear species, polar bears often actively hunt humans, using the same stalking techniques they employ when hunting seals. They are capable of tracking human scent across remarkable distances, particularly in cold conditions where scent molecules remain stable for extended periods. The evening before Marcus's camping expedition, PB447 was approximately 8 miles northeast of the bridge, investigating the remains of a bearded seal that had been partially consumed by another bear several days earlier. Satellite collar data later revealed that he spent over 3 hours at this location, feeding intermittently and testing wind currents for scent information. The collar's onboard sensors recorded his heart rate and body temperature, data that would later help scientists understand his physical condition and hunting motivations. PB447's body condition was suboptimal, a factor that would prove crucial in subsequent events. Climate change had shortened the sea ice hunting season by approximately 6 weeks compared to historical norms, forcing polar bears to survive longer periods on stored fat reserves. For a bear of PB447's size, this extended fasting period represented a critical energy deficit that drove increasingly desperate foraging behavior. The wind conditions that evening were creating exactly the kind of scent transport patterns that Thomas had warned about. Meteorological data later showed sustained winds of 32 miles per hour from the northeast, with gusts reaching 48 miles per hour. These winds were carrying air currents directly from the bridge area toward PB447's location, creating a perfect scent highway that would eventually draw the bear toward Marcus's campsite. Marcus established his camp under the bridge at approximately 6:30 p.m. on September 4th, about 90 minutes before sunset. He chose a location on the bridge's southern side, where the steel framework provided maximum protection from wind while still allowing him clear sightlines for photography. The spot was approximately 30 yards from the creek bed and elevated about 8 feet above the surrounding terrain, factors that Marcus believed would provide both safety advantages and superior camera angles. His campsite setup was methodical and professional, reflecting years of experience in challenging environments. Marcus had worked previously in Alaska's Denali National Park, the Canadian Arctic, and Patagonia, and he understood the critical importance of proper equipment and technique in extreme conditions. His shelter system consisted of a mountaineering-grade tent with a full rainfly, anchored using specialized ice screws designed for polar conditions. Inside the tent, he arranged his sleeping system in layers: a closed-cell foam pad for insulation from the ground, an inflatable sleeping pad for comfort, and a sleeping bag rated for extreme cold conditions. Marcus's photographic equipment represented a significant investment in professional-grade gear designed for Arctic conditions. His primary camera was a Nikon D850 with a specialized cold-weather housing paired with telephoto lenses ranging from 300mm to 600mm focal lengths. He had brought backup camera bodies, extra batteries kept warm in insulated pouches, and memory cards stored in waterproof containers. His tripod was a carbon fiber model designed to remain stable in high winds, with spiked feet for secure anchoring in ice and snow. The food storage system that Marcus implemented followed standard bear safety protocols, but it was designed primarily for black bears and grizzlies rather than polar bears. He suspended his food bag 15 feet off the ground using a pulley system attached to the bridge's steel framework, believing this would place it beyond the reach of any bear. What Marcus didn't fully appreciate was that polar bears are exceptional climbers, particularly on man-made structures, and that PB447 had demonstrated unusual problem-solving abilities in previous encounters with human equipment. As darkness settled over the Arctic landscape, Marcus began his photographic work. The bridge's steel framework created dramatic silhouettes against the star-filled sky, and the aurora borealis provided a spectacular backdrop of green and purple light dancing across the northern horizon. Marcus worked methodically, using long exposures to capture the interplay between human-made structure and natural phenomena. Exactly the kind of imagery he had envisioned when planning this expedition. Unknown to Marcus, PB447 had detected the first traces of human scent at approximately 8:45 p.m., when shifting wind patterns carried molecular traces of Marcus's presence across the tundra. The bear's initial response was curiosity rather than immediate predatory behavior. He raised his head, tested the air more carefully, and began moving slowly in the direction of the scent source. Polar bears possess one of the most sensitive olfactory systems in the animal kingdom, capable of detecting seals breathing through snow-covered breathing holes from distances exceeding 1 mile. Human scent, particularly in the concentrated form created by camping equipment and food storage, represents an even stronger attractant. PB447's approach toward the bridge was methodical and patient, characteristic of polar bear hunting behavior. Unlike other bear species, which might approach human activity sites directly, polar bears often employ complex stalking patterns that can take hours to execute. They circle downwind, test air currents from multiple directions, and gather information about potential threats or opportunities before committing to direct approach. The bear's movement pattern that evening, later reconstructed using satellite collar data and track analysis, showed that he spent over 2 hours conducting reconnaissance before beginning his final approach to Marcus's campsite. He investigated the area from 3 different directions, spending extended periods motionless while gathering scent and visual information. This behavior pattern was consistent with polar bear hunting strategies, where patience and stealth are essential for successful predation. At approximately 11:30 p.m., Marcus settled into his sleeping bag for the night, satisfied with the photographic work he had accomplished and eager to capture sunrise images in the morning. The temperature had dropped to -28 degrees Fahrenheit, and wind speeds had increased to a sustained 35 miles per hour, creating conditions that were challenging even for his high-quality equipment. Marcus had set up motion-activated cameras around his campsite, both for security purposes and to potentially capture wildlife images during the night. The sound environment under the bridge was dominated by wind noise, the constant howling of Arctic air moving through the steel framework, punctuated by occasional creaking and groaning as metal contracted in the extreme cold. These ambient sounds would later prove crucial in masking PB447's approach, as even the bear's substantial weight created relatively little noise compared to the environmental cacophony. Marcus's satellite communication device was functional and within easy reach, positioned just outside his sleeping bag where he could access it quickly if needed. The device was connected to the Iridium satellite network, providing reliable communication capabilities even in the remotest Arctic locations. However, the device required manual activation to send emergency signals, a factor that would prove significant in subsequent events. PB447 began his final approach to the bridge at approximately 12:45 a.m. on September 5th. Satellite data showed that he moved in a direct line toward Marcus's campsite, covering the final half-mile in just under 30 minutes. His movement speed was consistent with purposeful hunting behavior rather than casual investigation, suggesting that he had committed to investigating the scent source as a potential food opportunity. The bear's approach route took advantage of the natural terrain features that provided concealment from human observation. He followed the creek bed for the final 200 yards, moving against the wind to minimize his own scent signature, while maximizing his ability to gather information about the campsite. This level of tactical awareness is characteristic of polar bear hunting behavior and demonstrates why they are such effective predators in their natural environment. At approximately 1:15 a.m., PB447 reached the immediate vicinity of Marcus's campsite. The bear paused for several minutes at the base of the bridge structure, gathering detailed scent information and assessing the situation. Polar bears are highly intelligent animals, capable of complex problem-solving and tactical planning, and PB447's behavior suggested that he was evaluating multiple factors, including potential threats, escape routes, and the most effective approach to his target. Marcus remained asleep during these crucial minutes, unaware of the massive predator investigating his campsite less than 50 yards away. His sleeping bag was designed to muffle external sounds, and the constant wind noise masked any subtle sounds that PB447 might have made during his reconnaissance. The motion-activated lights that Marcus had positioned around his campsite failed to detect the bear's presence, either because PB447 was moving too slowly to trigger the sensors, or because he was approaching from angles that avoided the detection zones. The sequence of events that followed would be reconstructed later through physical evidence analysis, satellite collar data, and forensic examination of the campsite. PB447's initial focus was Marcus's suspended food storage system, which contained concentrated human scents and potential food odors that represented powerful attractants. The bear spent several minutes investigating the base of the tree where the food bag was suspended, testing different approaches to reach the elevated target. Polar bears are exceptional climbers, particularly on man-made structures, and PB447 demonstrated this capability by successfully ascending the steel framework of the bridge to reach Marcus's food storage. The bear's climbing technique involved using both his powerful claws and his substantial body weight to grip and navigate the steel beams, a process that created minimal noise due to the sound-dampening effects of extreme cold on metal surfaces. The retrieval of Marcus's food bag required approximately 15 minutes, during which PB447 systematically dismantled the pulley system and accessed the stored items. The contents included energy bars, dried fruit, instant coffee, and other concentrated food items that would have provided powerful scent attractants. More significantly for subsequent events, the food bag also contained Marcus's personal toiletries, including soap, toothpaste, and deodorant, items that polar bears often find attractive due to their concentrated chemical signatures. Marcus was awakened at approximately 1:45 a.m. by sounds that he initially interpreted as wind-driven movement of his equipment. His first conscious thought was concern for his cameras, which were positioned on tripods around the campsite and vulnerable to wind damage. Marcus lay still for several minutes, listening carefully and trying to identify the source of the sounds. The constant background noise of wind through the bridge structure made it difficult to distinguish specific sound sources, and Marcus's initial assessment was that he was hearing normal environmental sounds rather than wildlife activity. The realization that a polar bear was in his campsite came suddenly and terrifyingly. Marcus heard a distinct tearing sound, the unmistakable noise of fabric being ripped apart by powerful claws. He grabbed his flashlight and activated it, immediately illuminating PB447 less than 20 feet away, methodically destroying Marcus's food storage system and investigating the scattered contents. The bear's size was immediately overwhelming. PB447 stood approximately 4 feet high at the shoulder while on all fours, but his massive frame and thick winter coat made him appear even larger in the flashlight beam. His head was enormous, easily twice the size of a human head, with small dark eyes that reflected the light with an otherworldly intensity. The bear's coat was pristine white, except for dark staining around his mouth and paws, evidence of recent feeding activity. Marcus's first instinct was to remain completely motionless, hoping that the bear would complete his investigation of the food items and move away from the campsite. This strategy might have been effective with other bear species, but polar bears often react to human presence with curiosity rather than avoidance. PB-447's response to the flashlight was immediate and concerning. Instead of retreating, he oriented directly toward Marcus's tent and began approaching with purposeful, measured steps. The bear's approach behavior was characteristic of polar bear predatory sequences. Unlike defensive encounters with other bear species, where the animal might demonstrate threat displays or attempt to establish dominance, PB-447 showed the calm, methodical approach of a predator assessing prey. His head was held low, his movement was fluid and controlled, and his attention was completely focused on Marcus's position. Marcus fumbled for his air horn, a standard bear deterrent that produces sound levels exceeding 120 decibels and is generally effective at startling bears and causing them to retreat. However, his hands were clumsy with cold and fear, and the air horn was buried beneath other items in his equipment storage system. By the time Marcus located the device, PB-447 had approached to within 10 feet of the tent. The air horn's effect on PB-447 was minimal and temporary. The bear paused for approximately 30 seconds when Marcus activated the device, tilting his head and assessing this new sound source, but he showed no signs of retreat or alarm. Instead, PB-447 resumed his approach, apparently undeterred by the loud noise. This response was consistent with documented polar bear behavior in predatory situations. Unlike other bear species, polar bears often show minimal response to noise-based deterrents when they have committed to investigating a potential food source. Marcus's satellite communication device was within reach, but activating it required multiple button presses and several minutes to establish satellite contact and transmit emergency signals. With PB-447 now less than 8 feet away and showing clear predatory intent, Marcus made the decision to abandon his tent and attempt to reach higher ground on the bridge structure above his campsite. Exiting the tent required Marcus to unzip the door system, a process that took several crucial seconds and created movement and sound that further attracted PB-447's attention. As Marcus emerged from the tent, the bear was immediately aware of his presence and adjusted his position to maintain visual contact and optimal approach angles. The temperature differential between the tent interior and the outside environment was over 40 degrees Fahrenheit, creating an immediate physical shock that affected Marcus's coordination and decision-making abilities. Marcus was wearing thermal underwear and insulated boots, but lacked the heavy outer clothing that would normally be required for extended exposure to Arctic conditions. His plan was to climb onto the bridge structure above his campsite, where the steel framework would provide barriers between himself and the bear, while also offering potential escape routes and elevated positions that might discourage pursuit. The climb to the bridge deck required Marcus to ascend approximately 12 feet of steel framework, using cross beams and support structures as handholds and footholds. Under normal conditions, this would have been a manageable physical challenge for someone of Marcus's fitness level and climbing experience. However, the extreme cold immediately began affecting his manual dexterity and coordination. Metal surfaces at minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit can cause frostbite within minutes of direct skin contact, and Marcus's hands quickly began losing sensation and strength. PB-447's response to Marcus's climbing attempt was swift and decisive. Rather than remaining at ground level, the bear immediately began his own ascent of the bridge structure, demonstrating the climbing abilities that make polar bears such versatile and dangerous predators. PB-447's climbing technique was efficient and powerful. His claws provided secure purchase on the steel surfaces, and his substantial muscle mass allowed him to move vertically with surprising speed and agility. The pursuit sequence that followed lasted approximately 8 minutes and covered various levels and sections of the bridge structure. Marcus's advantage was his familiarity with the framework layout from his earlier photographic work, while PB-447's advantages included superior strength, cold tolerance, and climbing ability. Marcus was able to maintain separation from the bear by using narrow walkways and crossbeams that could support his weight, but presented more challenging navigation for the larger animal. However, Marcus's physical condition was deteriorating rapidly due to cold exposure. His core body temperature was dropping quickly, and his extremities were showing early signs of frostbite. His breathing was becoming labored due to the extreme cold air, and his coordination was increasingly affected by the physiological impacts of hypothermia. Most critically, Marcus was burning energy reserves at an unsustainable rate, while PB-447 showed no signs of fatigue or decreased motivation. The final phase of the encounter occurred when Marcus reached what he believed was a secure position on the bridge's upper deck, approximately 25 feet above the campsite level. The deck consisted of steel grating with gaps that provided footing while allowing wind and precipitation to pass through. Marcus positioned himself near the center of the span, where he had maximum distance from any point where PB-447 might access the upper level. PB-447's solution to this tactical challenge demonstrated the problem-solving intelligence that makes polar bears such formidable predators. Rather than attempting to directly access Marcus's position, the bear began systematically investigating the bridge structure, testing different approach routes and identifying structural weaknesses. After approximately 10 minutes of reconnaissance, PB-447 located a section of the framework where deteriorated support connections had created potential access to the upper deck. The steel framework of the bridge had been exposed to over 40 years of Arctic weather conditions, including freeze-thaw cycles, high winds, and chemical corrosion from sea spray. Several connection points had weakened significantly, and PB-447's investigation revealed areas where his substantial weight and strength could potentially compromise structural integrity. The bear began working at these weak points, using his claws and teeth to manipulate loose connections and create access opportunities. Marcus realized that his defensive position was not as secure as he had hoped. The bridge deck showed signs of structural deterioration, and several sections of grating were loose or missing entirely. More immediately concerning, PB-447's systematic approach to the structure suggested that the bear was problem-solving rather than simply acting on instinct, indicating a level of intelligence and persistence that made escape increasingly unlikely. The satellite communication device remained in Marcus's tent below, making emergency contact impossible without returning to ground level where PB-447 could easily intercept him. Marcus's other emergency equipment, including additional flares and survival gear, was similarly inaccessible. His options were rapidly narrowing to attempting to outlast the bear's interest or trying to reach the far end of the bridge where he might be able to descend and escape across the tundra. The wind conditions on the bridge deck were significantly more severe than at ground level, with sustained speeds exceeding 40 miles per hour and gusts approaching 60 miles per hour. The wind chill effect reduced the apparent temperature to approximately -60 degrees Fahrenheit. Creating conditions that would cause frostbite within minutes and potentially fatal hypothermia within an hour for someone wearing minimal protective clothing. Marcus's physical condition was deteriorating rapidly. His hands and feet were showing clear signs of frostbite, with reduced sensation and coordination that affected his ability to maintain secure positions on the steel framework. His core body temperature was dropping steadily, leading to mental confusion and impaired decision-making abilities. Most critically, his energy reserves were depleting quickly due to the combination of physical exertion, cold exposure, and psychological stress. PB-447 maintained his systematic investigation of the bridge structure, showing remarkable persistence and intelligence in his problem-solving approach. The bear's physical condition remained optimal throughout the encounter. His thick coat and substantial fat reserves provided excellent insulation against the cold, while his large muscle mass generated sufficient internal heat to maintain normal body temperature and coordination. The bear showed no signs of fatigue or reduced motivation, suggesting that he remained committed to accessing Marcus as a food resource. At approximately 2:20 a.m., PB-447 successfully created access to the upper bridge deck by leveraging a weakened support connection that allowed him to reach the steel grating level. The bear's approach was methodical and confident, indicating that he had solved the tactical challenge and was now moving to complete his predatory sequence. Marcus's defensive position had been compromised, and his physical condition was insufficient to support further evasive action. The final confrontation occurred in near-total darkness, illuminated only by starlight and the faint glow of the aurora borealis. Marcus had lost his flashlight during the climbing sequence, leaving him largely dependent on ambient light to navigate the treacherous bridge structure. PB-447's night vision was vastly superior, giving him a significant advantage in the final phase of the encounter. Marcus's last conscious memory was of the bear approaching his position with calm, measured steps, showing no signs of aggression or defensive behavior, simply the focused intent of a predator that had successfully cornered its prey. The bear's size was overwhelming at close range, and Marcus realized that physical resistance would be futile against an animal possessing several times his strength and weighing nearly 10 times as much. The attack itself was swift and decisive, consistent with polar bear predatory behavior. Unlike defensive encounters with other bear species, which might involve prolonged conflict and multiple phases, polar bear predation typically involves rapid incapacitation of prey followed by consumption. PB-447's approach was characteristic of an experienced predator, efficient, methodical, and focused on minimizing energy expenditure while maximizing success probability. Physical evidence recovered from the scene suggested that the attack lasted less than 2 minutes from initial contact to Marcus's loss of consciousness. The bear's technique was consistent with natural predatory sequences, indicating that PB-447 was treating Marcus as prey rather than responding defensively to a perceived threat. This distinction is crucial in understanding polar bear behavior and the particular dangers they present to humans in Arctic environments. The discovery of Marcus's remains occurred 36 hours later, when he failed to check in via satellite communication according to his planned schedule. Thomas Kanguk organized the initial search effort, using traditional tracking skills to follow the trail from Kaktovik to the bridge site. The scene that Thomas discovered was one of the most disturbing wildlife encounters he had witnessed in over 4 decades of Arctic experience. PB-447 had remained in the area for several hours after the attack, feeding and investigating Marcus's equipment and supplies. The bear had systematically dismantled much of the campsite, scattering gear across a wide area and destroying items that held concentrated human scents. The satellite communication device was found approximately 50 yards from the original campsite, damaged beyond repair by the bear's investigation. Thomas's initial assessment of the scene immediately identified it as a polar bear predation event rather than a defensive encounter or accidental confrontation. The physical evidence patterns, including track analysis and damage to equipment, indicated that the bear had approached the campsite deliberately and maintained presence in the area for an extended period. This behavior was consistent with successful predation rather than territorial defense or food cache protection. Sarah Martinez arrived at the scene approximately 2 hours after Thomas's discovery. bringing scientific methodology and documentation equipment to support the investigation. Her analysis of the satellite collar data confirmed that PB447 had been present at the bridge location during the time frame consistent with the attack, and his subsequent movement patterns indicated that he had remained in the immediate vicinity for over 6 hours after the initial incident. Elena Rostova's weather data provided crucial context for understanding the environmental factors that had contributed to the attack. Wind patterns on the night of September 4th had been optimal for scent transport from the bridge area to PB447's previous location, creating the conditions that initially attracted the bear to Marcus's campsite. Temperature and wind conditions had also been severe enough to rapidly compromise Marcus's physical capabilities once he was exposed outside his shelter system. The official investigation was conducted by Alaska Department of Fish and Game wildlife biologists, working in coordination with the North Slope Borough Search and Rescue Organization and the Alaska State Troopers. The investigation team was led by Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a wildlife biologist specializing in human-bear conflicts who had over 20 years of experience documenting and analyzing polar bear encounters throughout Alaska and northern Canada. Dr. Walsh's preliminary assessment confirmed the predatory nature of the attack and identified several factors that had contributed to the fatal outcome. The location selection, camping under a bridge structure that concentrated scents and provided limited escape routes, was identified as a primary risk factor. The weather conditions, which had facilitated scent transport while also compromising human physical capabilities, were identified as significant contributing factors. The investigation also examined Marcus's equipment and preparation methods, finding that while his gear was high quality and appropriate for Arctic conditions, his safety protocols were designed primarily for encounters with black bears and grizzlies rather than polar bears. The food storage system, while effective at deterring other bear species, was inadequate for preventing polar bear access due to their superior climbing abilities and problem-solving intelligence. PB447's satellite collar continued transmitting data throughout the investigation period, providing unprecedented documentation of polar bear behavior following a predation event. The data showed that the bear remained within a 2-mile radius of the bridge for over 48 hours after the attack, behavior that was consistent with territorial defense of a successful hunting area. This extended presence in the area created additional safety concerns for the investigation team and recovery operations. The recovery of Marcus's remains required specialized equipment and personnel trained in hazardous wildlife environments. The North Slope Borough Search and Rescue Team coordinated with Alaska Department of Fish and Game Enforcement officers to ensure that recovery operations could be conducted safely while PB447 remained in the area. The operation required helicopter support for personnel transportation and emergency evacuation capabilities. Dr. Walsh's team used non-lethal deterrent methods to temporarily displace PB447 from the immediate bridge area during recovery operations. These methods included helicopter overflights, noise-making devices, and rubber bullet applications, techniques designed to encourage the bear to leave the area temporarily without causing injury or long-term behavioral changes. However, PB447's response to these deterrents was minimal, consistent with his demonstrated lack of wariness around human activity. The forensic analysis of the attack site provided detailed information about polar bear predatory behavior that contributed significantly to scientific understanding of human-bear interactions. The physical evidence patterns confirmed that PB447 had approached the campsite deliberately and systematically, using stalking techniques consistent with natural prey pursuit rather than opportunistic investigation of human activity. Track analysis revealed that PB447 had conducted extensive reconnaissance of the campsite before initiating direct approach, spending over 2 hours gathering information about potential threats and opportunities. This level of tactical planning demonstrated the intelligence and problem-solving capabilities that make polar bears particularly dangerous to humans in Arctic environments. The condition and distribution of Marcus's equipment provided additional insights into polar bear behavior following successful predation. PB447 had systematically investigated items containing concentrated human scents, often destroying equipment in the process of investigation. Items with food odors or personal hygiene products received particular attention, while technical equipment like cameras and electronics were largely ignored unless they contained scent attractants. Sarah's analysis of PB447's satellite collar data revealed movement patterns following the attack that were consistent with territorial behavior around a successful hunting site. The bear had established a patrol pattern covering approximately 4 square miles centered on the bridge location, behavior that suggested he was defending the area against potential competitors and maintaining access to any remaining food resources. The extended investigation period provided opportunities to observe PB447's behavior in detail, contributing valuable scientific data about polar bear responses to human activity and environmental factors. The bear showed minimal response to helicopter overflights and investigation team presence, indicating a level of habituation to human activity that was concerning from a public safety perspective. Dr. Walsh's final report identified PB447 as a particularly dangerous individual bear due to his size, lack of human wariness, and demonstrated predatory success. The report recommended immediate action to relocate or remove the bear from areas of potential human contact, noting that successful predation on humans often leads to increased likelihood of repeat encounters and attacks. The decision regarding PB447's fate became a complex issue involving wildlife management policies, public safety concerns, and conservation considerations. Polar bears are protected under the Marine Mammal Protection Act and various international agreements, making lethal removal a last resort requiring extensive documentation and justification. However, bears that have successfully preyed on humans represent exceptional public safety risks that may warrant immediate intervention. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game convened an emergency review panel, including wildlife biologists, public safety officials, and traditional knowledge holders from local communities. The panel's deliberations considered multiple factors, including PB447's demonstrated behavior patterns, the availability of relocation options, and the broader implications for polar bear management in a changing Arctic environment. Thomas Kanguk's testimony provided crucial traditional knowledge about polar bear behavior and historical management approaches used by Inupiat communities. His experience suggested that bears exhibiting PB447's behavior patterns were unlikely to modify their approach to human interactions without intervention, and that the bear's continued presence near Kaktovik represented an unacceptable risk to community safety. The final decision was made to authorize lethal removal of PB447, a conclusion reached after careful consideration of all available alternatives. The bears demonstrated predatory behavior, lack of human wariness, and continued presence in areas of human activity were determined to represent an immediate and ongoing threat to public safety that could not be adequately managed through non-lethal means. PB447 was located and destroyed by Alaska Department of Fish and Game enforcement officers on September 8th, 3 days after the attack on Marcus. The bear was found approximately 1 mile from the bridge site, still within his established territorial patrol pattern and showing no signs of leaving the area voluntarily. His death marked the end of a remarkable but tragic case study in human polar bear interactions and climate change impacts on Arctic wildlife behavior. The necropsy examination of PB447 provided additional scientific data about the bear's physical condition and recent feeding history. The bear's overall body condition was found to be below optimal, consistent with the extended fasting periods and reduced hunting success that polar bears throughout the Arctic are experiencing due to climate change impacts on sea ice availability. Stomach content analysis confirmed that PB447 had consumed human tissue, providing definitive evidence of predatory behavior rather than scavenging or defensive reaction. The examination also revealed that the bear had been feeding on various alternative food sources, including vegetation, birds, and marine mammals. A diet diversity that suggested adaptation to changing environmental conditions and reduced availability of traditional prey species. The scientific value of the PB447 case extended beyond the immediate tragedy of Marcus's death. The detailed documentation of the bear's behavior, movement patterns, and environmental context provided researchers with unprecedented insights into polar bear adaptation strategies and the factors that contribute to human-bear conflicts in a changing Arctic environment. Sarah's research team used the data from PB447's case to refine their understanding of polar bear behavioral ecology and develop improved risk assessment protocols for human activities in polar bear habitat. The satellite collar data, combined with detailed site analysis and traditional knowledge input, created a comprehensive picture of polar bear hunting strategies and territorial behavior that informed future research directions. Elena's climatological analysis identified specific weather patterns and environmental conditions that increased the likelihood of human polar bear encounters. Her work contributed to the development of enhanced weather monitoring and prediction systems designed to provide early warning of conditions that might lead to increased bear activity near human installations and communities. The media coverage of Marcus's death brought international attention to the broader issues of climate change impacts on Arctic wildlife and the increasing frequency of human polar bear conflicts. National Geographic, which had originally assigned Marcus to document polar bear behavior, published a comprehensive article examining the circumstances of his death within the context of environmental change and wildlife management challenges. The story resonated with audiences worldwide, illustrating the personal human costs of environmental change, while also highlighting the complex challenges facing Arctic communities and wildlife managers. Marcus's photography, including images captured during his final assignment, provided powerful visual documentation of the Arctic environment and the polar bears that call it home. Thomas Kanguk became an important voice in discussions about traditional knowledge and wildlife management, speaking at conferences and workshops about the importance of integrating Inupiat understanding of polar bear behavior with contemporary scientific research. His perspective on the PB447 case emphasized the value of traditional ecological knowledge in predicting and preventing dangerous wildlife encounters. The bridge itself became a symbol of both the environmental changes affecting the Arctic and the ongoing challenges of human presence in polar bear habitat. The structure was eventually removed by the North Slope Borough as a public safety measure, eliminating a scent concentration point that might attract bears to the area in the future. Dr. Walsh's research team continued monitoring polar bear activity in the Kaktovik area, using PB447's case as a reference point for understanding normal versus problematic bear behavior patterns. Their work contributed to improved guidelines for researchers, photographers, and other professionals working in polar bear habitat, emphasizing the unique challenges and safety requirements associated with this species. The legal implications of Marcus's death were addressed through workers' compensation and insurance proceedings, as he was technically working on assignment for National Geographic at the time of the attack. The case established important precedents for media organizations and their responsibilities when assigning personnel to work in dangerous wildlife environments. Zara's continued research in the Arctic has focused on developing better methods for identifying individual bears that pose elevated risks to human safety. Her work combines satellite tracking technology, genetic analysis, and behavioral observation to create comprehensive risk profiles that can inform management decisions and public safety measures. The scientific papers published based on the PB447 case have become standard references in polar bear research literature, providing detailed documentation of predatory behavior and human-bear conflict dynamics that inform wildlife management practices throughout the polar bear's range. The case is regularly cited in training materials for wildlife biologists, park rangers, and other professionals working with dangerous wildlife. Elena's weather research has led to improved forecasting models that can predict environmental conditions likely to increase human-wildlife conflict risks. Her work is being implemented by various Arctic research organizations to enhance safety protocols and reduce the likelihood of dangerous encounters similar to the one that claimed Marcus's life. The memory of Marcus Chen continues to influence Arctic research and photography, with several wildlife organizations establishing safety protocols and equipment requirements based on lessons learned from his tragic encounter. His final photographs, captured during the days before his death, remain among the most powerful images of polar bears and Arctic environments ever documented. The bridge location has become an unofficial memorial site, visited occasionally by researchers and local community members who remember both Marcus's dedication to his craft and the tragic circumstances of his death. The site serves as a reminder of the ongoing challenges facing both humans and wildlife in a rapidly changing Arctic environment. Thomas continues to work with research teams and media organizations, providing traditional knowledge and safety guidance for people working in polar bear habitat. His experience with the PB447 case has made him one of the most sought-after guides for Arctic wildlife work, and his insights continue to prevent dangerous encounters while facilitating important research and documentation efforts. The broader implications of Marcus's death extend beyond individual tragedy to encompass the complex relationships between climate change, wildlife behavior, and human activities in the Arctic. The case illustrates how environmental changes can create new risks and challenges that require adaptive management approaches and enhanced safety protocols. Years later, the PB447 case remains a powerful reminder of both the beauty and the dangers of Arctic environments, and of the critical importance of respecting the power and intelligence of polar bears in their natural habitat. The lessons learned from Marcus's death continue to inform safety practices and wildlife management decisions throughout the polar bear's range, potentially preventing future tragedies while enabling continued research and documentation of these remarkable animals. I've created The Last Bridge, a substantial wilderness horror story that captures the atmospheric and detailed approach you requested. The story follows Marcus Chen, a National Geographic photographer who makes the fatal decision to camp under an abandoned bridge in Alaska's polar bear territory, despite warnings from local guides and researchers.